Across history, people have stepped into remote places and never returned. Some were explorers, some were scientists, sailors, hikers, pilots or children. All entered landscapes that could change in moments. Fog, snow, water, desert heat, shifting ice, dense forest. What they left behind were last sightings, broken clues, and long searches that found no answers. The man who gave his name to a desert, Alfred Gibson, 1874. There is a moment in the Australian interior when the heat stops behaving like heat. It starts behaving like a curtain. The horizon trembles, the sky blurs into the earth, and a person can lose all sense of distance. In that shimmering space, a young man named Alfred Gibson rode away from his expedition leader and into the red silence of Western Australia. No one ever saw him again. In 1874, explorer Ernest Giles was attempting one of the most ambitious crossings of the continent ever planned. He wanted to push from Central Australia toward the western edge, across land barely mapped and barely understood by European explorers. Supplies were limited, water was scarce, and every decision mattered. In a place where even strong animals collapsed without warning, an error was rarely forgiven. Gibson was not a seasoned explorer. He was a station hand about 23 years old, capable on horseback, and seemingly eager to prove himself. Giles later wrote that he would not have picked Gibson out of a crowd as the ideal companion for such a dangerous journey, but in the outback, manpower was a precious commodity. Gibson insisted he could ride, work, endure long distances without water, and handle whatever the bush presented. His enthusiasm was accepted, and he joined the team. The party travelled through the Rawlinson Range and beyond, pushing deeper into the inland. The ground changed constantly. Loose red sand, rocky rises, thick spinifex, brittle plains of stone that reflected heat like metal. Every few kilometres the land shifted personality, but never softened. The temperatures dragged moisture out of men and animals alike. Water holes were uncertain, sometimes little more than muddy indentations. In April of that year, disaster struck. One of Gibson's horses died, dropping without enough strength to go farther. Giles decided Gibson should take the remaining horse back to the last known water supply. The plan seemed simple. Ride back, refill, return to the group. Giles himself would walk ahead on foot. They separated under a sky that was cloudless and huge, each man becoming smaller with each step away from the other. That image, Gibson turning his horse toward the east, riding alone into the glare, is the last confirmed sighting of him. When Giles reached the rendezvous point days later, he expected to find Gibson waiting with water and supplies. Instead, the camp was empty. No hoofprints, no ashes from a small fire, no indication that Gibson had made it there at all. The desert had left no mark of him. Giles searched. He retraced paths, scanned horizons, and attempted to follow the faintest impressions in the sand. The land offered nothing. Whether the horse failed, whether Gibson became disoriented by the trick of light on the plains, whether he took a wrong bearing on his compass, none of it could be confirmed. All that remained was absence. It was then that Giles named the land ahead Gibson Desert. He wrote that it was a memorial to the first man claimed by those dunes under his leadership. The name was not chosen lightly. It was a recognition that the interior had taken a life, silently and completely. The desert did not return even a clue. Today the Gibson Desert stretches across a massive portion of Western Australia. It is one of the largest arid regions on the continent, marked by sweeping dunes, flat red plains, low rocky ridges and remote salt lakes. Few roads cross it. Even now it is known for its harshness, its long distances, and the kind of isolation that feels absolute. Travellers who move through it often speak of silence so thick it feels physical, as if the air itself is holding its breath. For Alfred Gibson, that landscape was final. His disappearance is one of those stories where the facts are minimal, the outcome is total, and the space between the two is filled only by the land itself. He left no journals, no final message. There are no quotes from him, no last words, no items recovered that might hint at what happened. His entire legacy rests in the choice of one name on a map, and that legacy is strangely large. Every atlas, every travel guide, every geological survey that labels Gibson Desert is repeating the memory of a man who vanished without a trace. A person who wanted adventure, who believed he could endure what the outback demanded, and who stepped directly into one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. In that sense, the desert carries a kind of quiet testimony. It remembers Gibson even though the world does not know how he died or where. It remembers him with vastness, with distance, with a heat that melts the line between horizon and sky. His story is not one of triumph, but of disappearance, pure and complete. As explorers pushed farther across Australia in the years that followed, Gibson's fate became a caution, a reminder that confidence was not enough, a reminder that the interior, flat on the map, empty to the eye, was a place where even strong men, fit men, determined men could simply disappear. His absence became part of the country's exploration history, marking the early years when the desire to cross the continent collided with the land's refusal to yield. The desert does not mark where he fell. There is no memorial stone or hidden grave, yet his presence lingers through geography itself, a name on a region so large that satellite imagery has to zoom out to hold it. A name that began with a young man riding towards what he believed was safety, only to vanish into heat that behaved like mist. And therefore his story stands here, at the beginning of this long journey through disappearances, not because it is the most complex nor the most debated, but because it captures the essence of what these stories share. A person moving forward into a place that does not give them back. A decision that seems small, a separation that seems temporary, a landscape that says nothing. Alfred Gibson rode into the desert to fetch water. That is all we know, and that was enough for the land to keep him. Vanished in the Red Centre, Ludwig Leichhardt's final march, 1848, he left behind a trail of careful handwriting, notes in tidy German script, pages full of observations about soil, birds, weather, and the quiet order of the landscape. These were the kinds of records Ludwig Leichhardt kept through every journey he made across Australia. But in his final march, the pages stop abruptly. No final entry, no closing line, no date. The handwriting simply ends and the man vanishes. Ludwig Leichhardt was born in Prussia, trained in languages, botany and geology, and arrived in Australia in the early 1840s. His curiosity was restless. The continent called to him with its vast interior and long stretches of land still unknown to European knowledge. Leichhardt was not a military explorer, not backed by a powerful institution. He was a scientist and a wanderer, and he believed that careful study and endurance could carry him across the continent. His early expeditions earned him fame. In 1844 he led a long journey from the Darling Downs to the far north of Australia, reaching Port Essington after months of hardship. Many had expected him to perish on that trip. Instead, he returned celebrated. He became known as one of the great figures of inland exploration, a man who had crossed huge distances with little more than determination, skill, and meticulous planning. But fame does not soften the interior of Australia. By the late 1840s, the Red Centre still stretched as a largely unmapped expanse of desert, scrub, salt lakes and dry river systems. Leichhardt wanted to cross it from east to west, an enormous undertaking even with a strong team, a good route and reliable rainfall. He believed it could be done. He believed the land would yield to calculation. In early 1848, he began preparing his most ambitious expedition. His plan was to travel from the region around present-day Queensland toward the Swan River settlement on the western coast. If successful, he would become the first European to cross the continent in a straight line from east to west. He gathered a small party of men, horses, bullocks and supplies. Diaries from earlier trips reveal how he thought: detail-oriented, observant, optimistic. Those same qualities would shape the beginning of his final march. As the team moved inland, the country opened into long stretches of scrub and sand, with dry creek beds and fragile waterholes. Rainfall in Central Australia is unpredictable, and their timing could not have been more precarious. The further they travelled, the more the land hardened around them. The expedition diaries from the men who had travelled with Leichhardt before describe how he kept strict routines, breaking camp early, recording weather, cataloguing plants, checking equipment. But after a certain point, the surviving documentary trail ends. The last known letter from Leichhardt dates from early April 1848. In it, he described the land ahead as difficult but not impossible. He wrote about his confidence in his party. He did not express fear nor mention any unusual danger. If he had concerns, they did not appear in his writing, and that letter would be the final verifiable message from him. Months passed with no word. As time stretched on, anxiety grew. At first, some believed delays were natural. Long expeditions often returned later than expected. But silence continued. There were no updates from inland stations, no sightings from pastoralists, no rumour carried along the small network of tracks and settlements. A search was ordered. Parties were sent into the interior, following the rough route Leichhardt was believed to have taken. They found nothing. No tracks, no campsites, no animal bones with markings. The land held the answers and refused to release them. Years later, a few items began to surface. A tree marked with an L, a brass plate inscribed with Leichhardt's name, a saddlebag, and later a rifle believed to have belonged to the expedition. These discoveries were scattered across enormous distances and at different times, hinting at movement, hardship, or attempts to survive. But they were fragments. None formed a continuous path. None showed what happened to the men or where they finally fell. The mystery hardened into a national legend. Leichhardt became known not only as a scientist and explorer, but as Australia's lost explorer. His disappearance drew fascination in Europe as well. Governments, private donors, and volunteers mounted more searches. Each search ended with new maps, new observations, new knowledge, but never with Leichhardt. Theories grew over the decades. Some believed the party died of thirst, overwhelmed by heat, with their bodies quickly absorbed by desert sands. Others suggested they were swept off course by storms, starved, or became stranded after animals died. A few posited that they reached more fertile land before succumbing to illness or conflict, but no theory could be confirmed. What endures most strongly is not their final moment, but the echo of Leichhardt's presence in the continent's memory. His notebooks, with their careful lists and quiet observations, remain in archives. His handwriting still carries the weight of a man certain of his purpose. His early expeditions contributed immensely to knowledge of Australia's flora, geography, and interior routes. Even today, his name appears in scientific papers, historical studies, and geographical features. Scholars revisit his journeys, and new analyses occasionally prompt searches in remote areas. Satellite imagery, archaeological surveys, and modern fieldwork continue to probe the outback for answers, some driven by science, others by the lingering desire to solve a story left open for more than 170 years. His disappearance occupies a unique space in Australian history. It is not simply a story of an expedition gone wrong. It is a story of ambition colliding with one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Red Centre has swallowed many things: campsites, tracks, evidence of ancient cultures, and remnants of old stations. It swallowed Leichhardt and his entire party, leaving only the faintest traces across millions of hectares. In that sense, his absence became part of the landscape. The idea of Leichhardt continues to move through Australian consciousness like a shadow. The explorer who set out with notebooks, instruments, and a belief in reason, and then disappeared so completely that even a vast modern nation still cannot find him. His last letter ends calmly, describing plans, observations, and a quiet belief that the route ahead, though difficult, could be crossed. There is no sign he feared what was coming. There is no hint of finality. Then the ink stops, and the man disappears into the centre of the continent. The pages are still there, the handwriting is still clear. The land he walked into remains silent and immense, holding the ending he never wrote. Chasing a Phantom Island, Edward von Toll in the Arctic, 1902. The Arctic has a way of erasing sound. Wind thins out into a distant hum, the ice shifts without warning, and even footsteps feel muted under layers of frozen crust. In that kind of silence, a man can walk away from his camp and disappear as if the sea itself inhaled him. That is what happened to Eduard von Toll, a Russian Baltic-German explorer whose final journey north was driven by the hope of finding a place no one could prove existed, Sanikoff Land. Among the earliest pages of Toll's surviving journals, there is a sense of calm precision. He wrote with a steady hand, describing everything from sea currents to the habits of Arctic birds. His handwriting, neat and compact, seemed untouched by the cold conditions around him. He had spent years studying the Siberian North, and by 1900 he was convinced that beyond the new Siberian islands lay a landmass previously glimpsed by hunters and explorers. Reports of it dated back to the early 19th century. Men spoke of seeing dark shapes on the horizon, high ground rising from the ice, an island that seemed to appear and disappear with the shifting weather. Toll believed this land was real. He believed it held geological clues to past climates, flora trapped in permafrost, and answers to how the Arctic had evolved. For him, this was not a myth. It was a mystery waiting for confirmation. With support from the Imperial Academy of Sciences, he set out aboard the vessel Zarya, a bark strengthened for Arctic conditions, equipped with sledges, dogs, rifles, supplies, and a small but capable crew. The expedition began in 1900, heading east along the vast Siberian coast. Zarya struggled against pack ice, moving through stretches where the ship groaned like a living thing. Toll kept writing, temperature readings, ice thickness, wind direction. He documented each day as if the record itself could keep the expedition anchored. But the Arctic is not a place that rewards persistence with mercy. The ship became trapped repeatedly, forced to drift with the ice. When leads opened, they pushed forward. When pressure ridges rose ahead of them, they waited. The search for Sannikov land demanded they reach the far northern reaches of the New Siberian Islands, but ice closed in early. Toll insisted they continue as long as conditions allowed. By 1902, the situation was critical. The ship could not progress further toward Bennett Island, where Toll hoped to set up a base and then push beyond. When the ice finally loosened enough, a small party managed to land on Bennett Island. From there, Toll wrote more entries about food, snow conditions, and the constant fatigue of the sled dogs. His tone shifted from analytical to weary but determined. He still believed the land they sought lay northward, just beyond the line of sight. Summer came late that year, and with it an unexpected setback. Zarya could not reach Bennett Island again. Heavy ice blocked the approach, leaving Toll and 3 companions stranded with only the supplies they had brought. Toll wrote final entries noting their intention to travel south by foot and sledge toward the mainland when conditions improved. He listed the equipment they would carry and the weight of their loads. Then his writing stops. Autumn arrived faster than expected. Temperatures dropped, daylight shortened, and no one on the ice saw Toll's group heading south. Zarya, battered and unable to reach them, was eventually forced to abandon the attempt and withdraw. But the story did not end there. A rescue mission formed, led by a young naval officer already known for his skill and resolve, Alexander Kolchak. He would later become a major figure in Russian history, but in 1903 he was still a determined Arctic explorer, willing to face extreme conditions to find his lost colleagues. Kolchak travelled by sledge, boat and foot, covering hundreds of kilometres along desolate coasts where the horizon blended with the sea ice. He visited camp after camp left by Toll, reading notes the explorer had left behind, brief documents fixed in wooden boxes or tucked under rocks. These notes were the last certain pieces of Toll's voice. Kolchak finally reached Bennett Island. There he found evidence of Toll's presence, a camp, a few tools and makeshift shelters, but no people, no bodies, no discarded equipment that would indicate a struggle. The only hint of Toll's direction was a note confirming that he and his 3 men had left the island late in the season to attempt the long return across drifting ice. Kolchak searched every lead, walking across the fractured surface where open water and ice blended unpredictably. He followed cracks, ridges and pressure lines, hoping to find signs, scraps of clothing, wood from a sledge, anything. The Arctic gave him nothing. He later wrote about the silence of the place. No footprints, no remains, no trace of which direction the men had taken. It was as if the ice had closed over them and smoothed the surface immediately afterward. The official conclusion was simple but unsatisfying. Toll and his companions died somewhere between Bennett Island and the Siberian mainland, likely falling through weak ice or being overtaken by winter storms. The reality behind that conclusion remains unknowable. Yet Toll's legacy did not vanish. His earlier discoveries, fossil plants preserved in permafrost, data about Arctic currents, and geological samples from previous expeditions helped deepen scientific understanding of the region. His detailed journal entries, preserved from earlier voyages, are still studied today. The phantom island he sought, Sannikov Land, has since been understood as a likely mirage created by temperature inversions and drifting icebergs. Modern surveys show no land where Toll believed one existed, but the image of him, striding across ice floes under a darkening sky, pointing toward a horizon he believed held answers, remains one of polar exploration's most haunting scenes. Kolchak's rescue mission became as famous as Toll's disappearance. Though he returned empty-handed, his meticulous effort mapped new sections of the coast and filled gaps in Arctic knowledge. His written reports conveyed respect for Toll's scientific drive and his refusal to abandon the idea of Sannikov land without proof. Between Toll's final entries and Kolchak's search logs, a story emerges not of failure, but of two men deeply committed to understanding one of the world's most hostile regions. Toll chased a land no one could confirm. Kolchak chased a man who left only footprints on drifting ice. Both stories have become part of the Arctic's long memory, frozen into its geography, carried forward through explorers, scientists and historians who still trace the routes they once walked. The ice where Toll vanished has long since melted and frozen again countless times. The wind that erased his tracks continues to blow across Bennett Island. And the journals he left behind, full of measurements and quiet observations, are the last solid evidence of a man who walked into the Arctic mist in search of something he believed was waiting just beyond the edge of sight. Frozen Silence, Franklin's Lost Expedition, 1845. The story begins with confidence. Two heavily reinforced ships, the Erebus and the Terror, stood ready in English harbours. The hulls strengthened with iron plating, their decks stocked with tools, instruments, scientific equipment, books, preserved food, and enough supplies to survive years in the Arctic. The officers wore their best uniforms, and the crew marched aboard with the pride of a nation behind them. In 1845, the British Admiralty believed it was on the verge of solving one of the world's greatest geographical puzzles, the Northwest Passage. Sir John Franklin was placed in command. He was experienced, respected, and determined. But the Arctic cares nothing for confidence. The wider pattern of Arctic exploration in those years was full of failures and narrow escapes. Ships became trapped for winters at a time. Ice sheets crushed wooden hulls as easily as shells. Men who misread weather or distance vanished into a landscape that rarely returned bodies. Yet the promise of the Northwest Passage, a potential trade route linking the Atlantic to the Pacific, was considered worth every risk. Franklin sailed from England with 129 men, certain that his expedition would be the one to succeed. For the first months, everything seemed normal. Whaling ships recorded sightings of the Erebus and Terror entering Baffin Bay. The ships pushed into Lancaster Sound, the expected entryway into the passage. After that, no confirmed sighting would ever be recorded again. The ice closed behind them like a door. For 2 years, no word reached England. This was not entirely unusual. Arctic expeditions often returned later than planned. But by the 3rd year, concern hardened into fear. The Admiralty launched search missions. At one point, more than 10 ships were sent north, scanning Lancaster Sound, Barrow Strait, and the islands scattered across what is now northern Canada. They found nothing. As time passed, the missing expedition transformed into a national obsession. Newspapers speculated endlessly, families begged for answers, and governments funded new voyages. Search parties found traces of earlier explorers, driftwood, abandoned caches, but nothing from Franklin. The Arctic's silence only deepened. The breakthrough came not from European crews, but from Inuit testimony. Local Inuit hunters described men dragging boats over the ice, starving and exhausted. They spoke of a ship trapped, then sinking. They described clothing, weapons, metal tools exchanged or found. Their accounts were detailed and consistent, but British searchers struggled to interpret them fully. Still, they offered the first clear indication that Franklin's men had abandoned their ships and attempted to walk south across King William Island. Years later on that island, a single paper was discovered under a cairn, a brief message written in 2 stages. The first, from 1847, noted that all was well, the ships were trapped in ice, but the crew was healthy. The second edition, dated 1848, was drastically different. It reported that Franklin had died. The ships remained stuck. 24 men were already dead. The survivors were abandoning the vessels and would attempt to march overland toward the Back River. The message ended without emotion, written in the clipped tone of duty. It was the last official note from the expedition. Search teams found scattered human remains along the island's western coast, remnants of camps, abandoned equipment, and traces of desperate travel. Snow goggles made from tin, stoves, boots, fragments of clothing. Some remains showed signs of extreme malnutrition. Others bore marks suggesting that in their final collapse the starving men may have resorted to extreme measures to stay alive. The evidence painted a grim picture. The long march south had failed. But the ships themselves remained missing, their final positions unknown. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the mystery became one of polar exploration's most enduring stories. Writers and historians revisited the case repeatedly. Artists painted scenes of ghostly ships trapped in towering ridges of ice. Adventurers retraced the route, searching for more clues. Scientific debates emerged over what caused the disaster: lead poisoning from canned food, scurvy, starvation, cold, or simply the impossible conditions of the Arctic. Each theory explained something, but none explained everything. The loss of the Erebus and Terror entered global imagination. The story carried both tragedy and fascination. Two ships leaving with pride and disappearing into a world of ice that resisted all attempts to solve their fate. More than 160 years later, modern technology finally succeeded where countless search missions had failed. In 2014, marine archaeologists located the wreck of HMS Erebus in the shallow waters off King William Island. The ship sat upright, remarkably preserved by the cold, clear Arctic Sea. 2 years after that, HMS Terror was found in an even more pristine condition, resting quietly on the seabed as if still waiting for its crew to return. The discoveries confirmed Inuit oral histories with striking accuracy. The wrecks were exactly where Inuit communities had said they should be, in locations Europeans had overlooked despite repeated searches. In many ways, the final understanding of the expedition depended not on modern equipment, but on voices that had been ignored in the 19th century. Even with the wrecks located, the exact sequence of events remains uncertain. Why did the ships become hopelessly trapped? How far did the men travel before collapsing? What happened to Franklin himself in his final days? The cold preserved the vessels, but the ice did not preserve answers. The cultural footprint of the expedition continues. Museums across the world display items recovered from the search missions: compasses, journals from other explorers, and pieces of equipment believed to be linked to Franklin's men. Novels, documentaries, paintings, and academic studies still examine the disaster from every angle. The story feels suspended, incomplete, and permanently open to interpretation. Franklin himself, once celebrated as an Arctic hero, became a symbol of something broader: the limits of human confidence in the face of nature. His ambition mirrored that of many explorers of the era, driven by national pride, scientific curiosity, and personal duty. But the Arctic, with its shifting ice, hidden currents, and unforgiving seasons, was a landscape that swallowed ambition with indifference. Today, when researchers visit the wreck sites, they move through a world that has barely changed since 1845. The cold water preserves wood, metal, and even delicate objects. The Erebus and Terror remain there, silent and still, testimonies to a moment frozen in time. The footprints of the men who walked south have long been erased by snow and wind, but their story endures, carried forward not by the land, but by generations who refused to let the mystery fade. Franklin's expedition began with the hope of opening a passage. Instead, it opened a chapter of history that would refuse to close. The Arctic kept its silence, but the world kept searching, and the names Erebus and Terror remain anchored in the cold, symbols of a journey that pushed too far into a place unwilling to reveal its depths. Night on the Pass, the Dyatlov Incident, 1959. People often hear the story long before they know the place. A torn tent, footprints in the snow, bodies scattered across a frozen slope. The Dyatlov Incident has been retold so many times that myths began growing like frost over a window. Glowing orbs, invisible weapons, strange creatures, military secrets. The more the story spread, the more those myths took hold. But somewhere beneath the layers lies the real event, rooted not in fantasy, but in cold, wind, fear, and decisions made on a winter night in the northern Ural Mountains. In January 1959, a group of 10 students and recent graduates set out from Sverdlovsk for a long trek through deep winter terrain. They were skilled, disciplined, and familiar with harsh conditions. The leader, Igor Dyatlov, was respected for his experience and calm leadership. Their plan was to ski toward the remote peak of Otorten and return with photographs, journal entries, and the achievement of completing a difficult route. After the first days, one of the hikers fell ill and turned back. The remaining 9 pressed forward. Their diaries from the early part of the journey show a cheerful group. They joked, sang songs, wrote about the cold but never about fear. Photographs taken on the trail show them smiling, laughing, leaning on their skis. Nothing in their journals hints that danger was approaching. Everything feels normal. On February 1st, they reached the slopes of a mountain called Kholat Syakhl. Strong winds and worsening visibility forced them slightly off their planned route. Instead of descending to a forested area with shelter, they stopped on an exposed shoulder of the mountain to pitch their tent. Why they chose that precise location remains debated. Some believe they were tired and losing daylight. Others think they were practicing a difficult campsite technique. Whatever the reason, they dug into the snow, anchored their tent and settled in for the night. Sometime after dark, everything changed. Search teams would not know it until weeks later, but that night the group fled the tent in a rush so sudden that they cut their way out from the inside. The tent fabric was sliced open with a knife. Their warm clothes and boots were left behind. Tracks in the snow showed that some walked, some staggered, some wore only socks or a single shoe. All moved downslope in the direction of a sparse stand of trees. Those tracks would be the first clues searchers found. When the rescue teams arrived in late February, the tent immediately signalled that something had gone terribly wrong. It sat tilted and half buried, still anchored to the slope. Inside were jackets, equipment, food, journals, and a stove that had not been used. The tracks leading away were still visible beneath the snow crust, showing the group leaving in an orderly line, as if they were not chased but compelled. The first two bodies were discovered at the forest edge, near the remains of a small fire. Both were lying in their underwear, without boots or coats. A cedar tree nearby had broken branches several meters high, suggesting one or two of the hikers had climbed it, perhaps trying to see back toward the tent through the blowing snow. The cold had claimed them quickly. 3 more bodies, Dyatlov among them, were found between the tree line and the tent, as though they had tried to crawl or walk back uphill. Their positions in the snow told a simple story. They were attempting to return to safety but couldn't make it. The temperatures that night could have dropped far below -20 Celsius, with powerful winds cutting exposed skin in minutes. The remaining 4 were not found until the thaw months later. They lay in a small ravine deeper in the woods, under several meters of snow. These hikers had more clothing, suggesting they survived longer. Yet their injuries puzzled investigators. Severe chest fractures, cracked skulls, internal damage without major external wounds. In the early reports, some examiners compared the trauma to what might be seen in a high-speed impact. The odd nature of those injuries later helped fuel the myth-making. Then there were small details, traces of radiation on some clothing, reports of unusual skin discoloration, missing eyes or soft tissue affected by natural decomposition. Even though many of these details had ordinary explanations, like environmental effects or contamination, people seized on them. This void of certainty created the perfect environment for wild theories. Yeti attacks, secret Soviet weapons, foreign spies, energy waves carried by the wind, even extraterrestrial involvement. The incident became a magnet for mystery. But when we strip away the noise, we return to the mountain. One widely supported explanation focuses on what is called a slab avalanche, a sudden release of a compact block of snow that can occur even on moderate slopes. If the hikers cut into the snowpack to build their tent platform, they may have destabilized a hidden weak layer. Hours later, as wind piled more snow along the ridge, a slab could have broken loose and crashed onto the tent. Not enough to sweep them away, but enough to crush the structure, injure some of the occupants, and make the tent unsafe or impossible to exit through the front. In that moment, cold, dark, confused, and partially dressed, the group cut their way out and fled downslope to escape danger. Without proper clothing, they would have had minutes before the cold robbed them of coordination. Some tried to build a fire, others attempted to return for supplies, others moved toward the ravine, possibly seeking shelter. The severe injuries found on some bodies could match the weight of a heavy snow slab compressing them against hard ground. Another possibility is the effect of strong katabatic winds, violent gusts that roar down mountainsides. Such winds can cause panic and disorientation, strip away tents, and make communication impossible. Combined with freezing temperatures, this could push a group into irrational but desperate actions. Whatever the precise trigger, the landscape itself created a chain reaction of fear, cold, and confusion. The pass where the hikers died now bears Dyatlov's name. Visitors come to stand where the tent once stood, to see the sparse line of trees where the first bodies were found, to walk the same frozen ground. The story has become part of Russia's cultural memory, a tragedy, a puzzle, a reminder of how quickly conditions can turn deadly. The 9 hikers entered the mountain with confidence, experience and planning. They left behind photographs, notebooks, and a tent torn open from within. The snowmelt uncovered the last of them, but not the final answers, and the pass remains, swept by wind, guarded by ridges, holding the silence of that night in 1959. Into the green twilight, Percy Fawcett and the Lost City of Z, 1925. His handwriting was steady, almost elegant, even when the rain smudged the paper. In one of his last letters, Percy Fawcett wrote about the forest closing in, about the silence between the trees, and about the confidence he had in the route ahead. There was no hint of doubt, no warning, just a man who believed the mystery he had been chasing for years was finally within reach. When he sealed that letter, he did not know it would be one of his final messages to the outside world. Fawcett's obsession began long before 1925. Born in England and trained as a surveyor, he served in the Royal Geographical Society and worked on boundary commissions in Bolivia and Brazil. Through these expeditions, he became fascinated by stories of ruins hidden in the interior, older than known civilizations, protected by river systems and thick canopy. He read ancient chronicles, gathered indigenous accounts, and interpreted fragments of colonial reports. From these pieces he constructed the idea of a lost city deep in the Brazilian Amazon, what he called Z. His journals show the tone clearly, disciplined, optimistic, and increasingly convinced. He believes Z represented an advanced civilization, long forgotten, capable of building stone structures and maintaining fields in an environment most Europeans saw as impenetrable. He wrote of pottery fragments, oral histories, and signs of ancient habitation. Whether Z was real or not mattered less than the momentum the idea gained in his mind. He was certain it existed. By 1925, he decided to make the final attempt to find it. This time, he would not travel with large caravans. He believed smaller groups moved better through dense forest, avoided unnecessary attention, and preserved the goodwill of indigenous communities along the way. He chose only 2 companions, his son Jack, 21 years old, and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel. Both were young, strong, and trusted by him. Before leaving, Fawcett sent letters outlining his plan. He expected to travel through Mato Grosso, reach the headwaters of the Xingu, and then follow a route told to him by indigenous guides on earlier journeys. He wrote that the 3 of them moved light and fast. He also wrote a warning. If he disappeared, no one should come after him. The forest, he said, swallowed those unprepared for it. They entered the Amazon in April. Travellers who saw them described Fawcett as calm, determined, and in good health. They carried minimal supplies, trusting they would resupply through hunting, fishing, and trade with villagers along the way. They reached the area near the upper Xingu by late May. From there, the forest thickened and the rivers narrowed. The last confirmed sign of them came from a letter Fawcett sent home through a messenger. In it, he noted that the expedition was going well, the men were in good spirits, and they were approaching a region he considered promising. His words gave no indication of struggle. Nothing suggested the danger ahead. After that message, there was silence. Complete, uninterrupted silence. The Amazon has a long history of swallowing expeditions. The region is enormous, humid, and layered in vegetation so dense that even a few meters off a trail, a person can become invisible. It was not unusual for travellers to vanish. Disease, rivers, weather, conflict with local groups, any of these could end a journey. Yet the disappearance of Fawcett became something larger. When he failed to return, rumours circulated quickly. Some claimed he had found the city and stayed there. Others said he was killed by hostile warriors. Some believed he died of illness or starvation. The most dramatic stories insisted he had chosen not to come back, that Z had welcomed him. Each theory built on fragments, none on verifiable evidence. Then came the searches. Despite his warning, hundreds of people launched expeditions to find him over the decades. Some were professional explorers, others adventurers seeking glory, and others simply curious. Many underestimated the forest. Several disappeared themselves. In some cases, entire rescue parties were lost or forced to retreat, overcome by disease, exhaustion, or hostile encounters. The legend of Fawcett's fate grew with every failed attempt to uncover it. Indigenous accounts varied. Some communities reported seeing a small group of outsiders pass through. Some described battles far upriver involving unknown men. Others said they heard stories from neighbouring groups about strangers who never returned. Each testimony offered glimpses, but no certainty. The forest filtered every detail, leaving only shadowed reports. Over time, a few items surfaced: a compass, bones, pieces of metal, but none were definitively linked to Fawcett. Many supposed discoveries turned out to be unrelated. The truth remained elusive. The deeper story of Fawcett's disappearance is not only about him, but about the Amazon itself. To outsiders, the forest seemed endless. To those who lived within it, it was structured, filled with networks of paths, resources, and relationships. European explorers often misunderstood how challenging it was to travel through the region without deep local knowledge. Fawcett admired indigenous skill and wrote respectfully about them, but even respect could not guarantee safety. His belief in Z persisted long after his death. Later archaeological discoveries, in places like the Upper Xingu Basin and across the southern Amazon, have revealed evidence of complex ancient settlements, geometric earthworks, large villages connected by roads, and traces of engineering that contradict the old assumption that the rainforest could never support advanced societies. These findings do not confirm Z, but they echo the possibility that Fawcett may not have been entirely wrong to imagine sophisticated civilizations hidden beneath centuries of growth. Fawcett's absence shaped the modern myth. Books, films, and countless articles retold his story. His letters, once routine documents written from isolated camps, became artifacts studied for clues. Even those who doubted Z found themselves drawn to the puzzle of how an experienced explorer, his son, and their companion could vanish so completely. The place where they were last seen, a region of dense forest and branching rivers, remains largely unchanged today. Travellers describe the same walls of green, the same heavy air, the same sudden quiet that descends when the forest decides to listen. Somewhere in that expanse, the trail of 3 men ended. The disappearance of Percy Fawcett is not solved. It exists in the space where ambition meets an unforgiving landscape. His belief in Z continues to cast a long shadow, not because the city has been found, but because the idea of it refuses to fade. His story belongs to every explorer who followed his path, and to every map that still holds blank spaces where certainty has never taken root. And as long as the forest stands, his final steps remain there, somewhere inside the green twilight that closed around him and never opened again. The desert poet who never came back, Everett Roos, 1934. He liked to write about light, how it moved along canyon walls, how it poured into narrow slots at dawn, how it danced across the desert floor like a living thing. In one of his letters, Everett Roos wrote, "I've seen beauty too great for words." That sentence, simple and sincere, would outlive him. Because after 1934, the writer of those lines stepped into the Utah canyons and never returned. Everett Roos was only 20 years old when he vanished, but he had already built a life that seemed impossible for someone so young. Born in California, raised by parents who valued art and literature, he grew into a restless wanderer. He painted, carved linoleum prints, wrote letters with a poet's confidence, and carried on conversations with the silence of the desert as if it were an old friend. He travelled alone with little more than a bedroll, notebooks, and his 2 burros, often trading paintings for food. In his words, the desert was not empty, it was soul-filling. By the early 1930s, he had travelled through large stretches of the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Utah. Friends he made in small towns remembered him as kind, gentle, and intense. Ranchers who saw him pass through thought he looked fragile, but they noted how confidently he moved through terrain that would intimidate even experienced locals. In November 1934, he arrived near the tiny settlement of Escalante, Utah, preparing for another solo journey into the canyons. His last letters, written in his careful script, carried no sense of fear. He wrote that he was in good spirits and excited to see what waited beyond the next bend in the slick rock. He intended to travel through Davis Gulch and explore the Escalante River region, remote even now, and in the 1930s almost untouched. Those letters became the last solid record of his voice. After he rode out of Escalante, the trail becomes faint. A few sheep herders later reported seeing him near Davis Gulch. Another said he watched Everett lead his burros along the rim of a canyon. Then, as the days turned to weeks and winter approached, no further sightings came. When he failed to reappear in any nearby town, his parents grew concerned. They had always supported his wanderings, even when they feared for his safety, but weeks of silence stretched too long. They contacted authorities and a search began. The first clue was simple and heartbreaking. Both of Everett's burros were found grazing alone at the bottom of Davis Gulch. They were healthy, saddles removed, packs empty. Nearby, searchers found a small campsite, just a few belongings and signs of a temporary stay. But there were no footprints leading away, no trail, no indication that he'd left with the animals. It looked as if the campsite had simply been abandoned. The canyon walls around the site were high, smooth and steep. If Everett had attempted to climb or descend in poor weather, a fall was possible. But no body, clothing or equipment was discovered. Searchers combed the gulch, the riverbanks and the cliffs. They found nothing else. In the years that followed, more people looked for answers. Some believed he drowned in a flash flood. Others thought he fell from a cliff and his remains were hidden by rock falls. A few speculated he left the canyon to start a new life under a different name. That last theory gained ground decades later, when skeletal remains were found in a remote area. But forensic analysis eventually disproved any connection. The desert kept its silence. As often happens, when facts end, legend begins. Everett Roos became more than a lost young man. He became a symbol. His letters and journal entries were published, revealing a mind driven by beauty, solitude, and a longing for something he could never quite name. He wrote about wanting to go forever, about feeling more alive in the wilderness than anywhere else. Those lines captured the imagination of artists, naturalists, and wanderers. They saw him not as someone who vanished, but as someone who became part of the land he loved. Writers compared him to other seekers who disappeared in wild places. Photographers traced his final routes. Hikers stood in the shade of the same cliffs he once drew. An entire generation of desert lovers embraced him as an unofficial patron saint of solitude. But the real Everett Roos was not a myth. He was a young man with dreams, fears, and a family who never stopped searching for the truth. His parents returned to the desert multiple times, hoping for closure. His brother spent years writing letters to people who claimed to know something. Each lead faded. Decades later, researchers and historians gathered fragments of evidence, old photographs, oral histories, archived letters. They walked Davis Gulch again and again, imagining Everett's last movements, leading his burros between cottonwoods, stopping to sketch, climbing high ridges to see the horizon. The canyon has changed since 1934. Parts of it now lie beneath the waters of Lake Powell, which filled in the 1960s. Whatever clues once rested on the canyon floor may now be under silt and deep blue water, and yet his words survive. Lines from his letters are carved into memorials, printed in books, quoted in lectures, repeated by people who find meaning in his disappearance. Passages describe the red rock glowing at sunset, the feeling of standing alone beneath towering cliffs, the joy of seeing stars through cold desert air. He wrote these ideas with an honesty that still resonates. His legacy is not a map or a solved case, but a sense of wonder passed down through those pages. The desert around Escalante remains as silent as ever, canyons twisting into the distance, dry washes turning without warning, sandstone eroded into impossible shapes. Somewhere in that landscape, Everett Roos took his final steps. Whether through accident, misjudgment, or a moment of fate, the canyon closed around him with the same quiet he admired in life. Today his name appears in guidebooks, his art hangs in collections, and his words live on long after the places he walked have changed. People still walk to the cliffs above Davis Gulch. They look out at the same rugged beauty he once described. They read his letters aloud into the wind, and for a moment they feel the presence of the young man who vanished into the desert and left only his voice behind. Soft, lyrical, and unfinished. Asia's Devil's Triangle. Peng Jamu in Lop Nur, 1980. The heat waves rose from the salt pan like a mirage. The ground cracked, the air shimmered, but it was not the kind of place a scientist usually remembers for its beauty. It was the kind of place a scientist remembers for its emptiness. And in June 1980, Peng Jamu, a man trained for the lab, comfortable in white coats, stepped into that emptiness in the remote region of Lop Nur and left the known world behind. Peng had already spent decades exploring China's arid frontiers. A biochemist by training, he had catalogued plants and measured chemical deposits in Xinjiang's deserts for his country's academy. He believed that the wild corners of the land held secrets as real as the flasks in his lab, species unknown, landscapes unsubdued, data untouched. In 1980, he led a team of geologists, biologists, chemists and support staff deep into the Lop Nur Basin. Their mission: study the soil, the salts, the shifting dunes and the slowly drying lake bed. But desert science demands constant vigilance. Nothing stays fixed, nothing stays friendly. The basin of Lop Nur lay at the eastern fringe of the Tarim Basin in northwestern China. Once a vast salt lake, it had dried up over the decades. The terrain became a haunted place of drifting sands, hard salts, yardang ridges carved by wind, and temperature swings that blistered skin by day and stung lungs by night. Vehicles bogged down in soft riverbeds, old river channels buried by dune shifts. Water, constant water, was always the fragile link. On June 17, 1980, Peng walked out of the camp alone. He left a note. "I'm going out to find water." He took only his 2 cameras and a water bottle. The team waited. Hours passed. Then the desert's silence settled in. The vehicles stopped in their tired lines of dust. The support crew called his name and heard nothing. The nothing stretched on. Soon the central government ordered one of the most extensive search operations China had mounted in such terrain. Planes scanned the basin from above. Soldiers, scientists and local volunteers combed the shifting ground. They probed soft sand, salt crusts, dune ridges. They followed footprints when visible, they drilled when necessary. But the desert offered only shifting contours, shifting light, shifting horizons. Among the searchers, several promising leads appeared. Human remains were found in a few instances between 2005 and 2007. Skeletons buried in shallow pits of sand or camouflaged under drifts. None could be reliably confirmed as Peng. The region's instability meant even bodies rarely stayed where they fell. Sandstorms, wind-harvested dust and salt flats erased tracks faster than investigations could record them. It is here that we view Lop Nur not as a backdrop but as the protagonist of the story. The landscape isn't merely dangerous, it is indifferent, persistent, capable of swallowing traces and keeping still when every effort has been made to find them. The basin's title as Asia's Devil's Triangle comes less from romance and more from reality. Shifting underfoot, hidden lakes beneath salt crusts, desert storms that move like ghosts, sand hills that collapse unexpectedly. Peng's team described the route. After the major vehicles reached the camp area, several relays of research began. Cars became stuck. Drivers traded boots for sand-proof cloth. Water rations entered a ledger of scarcity. In an interview some years later, a colleague remembered that Peng told the team, "Science is to walk a road not travelled by other people." The words were meant to inspire. But when those roads lead into dried lake beds and loose soil hills, inspiration must compete with survival. 5 days after his departure from camp, the support team officially declared him missing. The note he left became a cleft in the story. On one side, a deliberate scientist walking out for water. On the other side, the desert's silent response. The search teams recorded that between June 16th and 17 there had been strong winds, some described as gusts high enough to bury a camel in days, with only its leg visible above the salt crust. That means Peng may have entered an area where wind-loaded sand and collapsing hills could engulf a man without a sound. For decades the fascination grew. The search did not end when vehicles turned back. Satellite surveys, local oral history, amateur expeditions all peered into the basin. The desert kept giving, his name, his cameras, the idea of a man swallowed by terrain. But not the body, not the last footsteps. Peng's disappearance became a symbol for science, for sacrifice, for the unknown corners of one of the largest countries on Earth. The basin itself changed. As the years passed, mining, rail construction and access roads entered the region. Yet even with greater human activity, the central sand plains remained treacherous. Streams of potassium-rich salt still shimmer under afternoon sun. Yardang ridges still stand like frozen waves. Dust storms still sweep across without warning. Because the desert isn't changed by humans, it absorbs them. The other side of the story is the legacy. Peng's name appears on memorials. He's considered a martyr of science in his country. His earlier work cataloguing flora and fauna in that region remains respected. His last expedition, even in failure, inspired a generation of Chinese explorers and desert scientists. They learned that the frontiers are not only mountains or oceans, they can be basins of salt, deserts of silence. Moreover, his disappearance reframed how we view exploration. Not all journeys are made to plant flags or claim peaks. Some are made to measure, to observe, to catalogue, and sometimes those journeys end not with a return, but with a waiting of decades. The desert holds the final terms of the story. You may enter, but it need not offer you back. In many modern accounts, the Lopner region is mentioned alongside vanished explorers, lost expeditions, unreachable places. Maps still show the basin. Geologists still study its salt flats. But echoes of Peng's route, the cars stuck in soft riverbeds, the note left for water, and the vanished man remain central to the myth. That myth is a powerful device. It binds the real work of science, the life of a man, the desert terrain, and the when-then of disappearance into one narrative. His 2 cameras, his ambition, his final step into the heat all become part of something larger than a single missing person. They become part of a region's legacy, a country's frontier, and the idea that some places resist explanation. The basin whispers names, the salt flats shift, the desert holds still. Peng Jiamu walked into the unknown, leaving behind the organised world of the academy and entering the world where maps end, where water hides, where time does not hurry back. And in that space the search continues, memories persist, and the sand still shifts. The Air and the Headhunters, Michael Rockefeller, 1961. He sailed into silence. A young man, pulled from privilege and pedigree, stepping into a canoe in a remote part of New Guinea. The water was dark, the shore ahead was uncertain, and beneath everything lay stories of art, of tribes, of revenge that would outlast him. That man was Michael Rockefeller, and the land he entered did not give him back. Michael Clark Rockefeller was born into one of America's most powerful families. He graduated from Harvard, eager not for finance or politics, but for culture, for art, for the lives of people outside his world. In the summer of 1961, he travelled to Dutch New Guinea, now part of Indonesia. Drawn by the extraordinary wood-carving traditions of the Asmat people in the coastal swamps, he took cameras, sketches, and the sense that a piece of human creativity existed in that world no one beyond it had fully seen. In letters home, he described the Asmat region as a huge puzzle of variation, ceremonies, carvings, masks, an ancient continuity untouched by Western urgency. He wrote that the chaos of waves and forests masked a subtle order. That clarity captured attention. It also captured his intention. He planned to collect, study, document, and perhaps walk safely between worlds. On November 17, 1961, his catamaran was swamped off the Asmat coast. The 2 local guides reached shore safely, but Rockefeller and Dutch anthropologist René Wassing sat adrift atop the overturned craft. 2 days later, Rockefeller told Wassing, "I think I can make it." He improvised a float from a petrol tank, said he would swim to shore. Wassing watched him move away, then vanished. A massive search followed. No remains, no definitive trace. But the absence birthed a multitude of narratives. The myth grew fast. Early on, drowning seemed the simplest answer. Strong current, open sea, exposed swim in tropical waters. Yet over time, rumours gathered weight. The Asmat were known historically for headhunting and cannibalism, ritual acts embedded in cycles of revenge and survival. Missionaries, colonial officers, villagers began to claim that Rockefeller reached shore, was captured, killed, eaten. Accounts described bones turned into tools, trophies taken, pieces divided among tribal members. One missionary reported skull fragments missing jaws, holes that matched weapons. Some reports even claimed that villagers admitted to dismembering him. These stories attracted journalists, books, documentaries. The idea of a Rockefeller eaten in New Guinea became part cautionary tale, part spectacle. It echoed colonial guilt, art theft, and the encounter of world's richest with one of the world's most remote. But we must step back into the documented evidence to understand the real contours behind the myth. Search operations in 1961 included Dutch, Australian and US forces. They combed rivers, swamp flats, mangroves, and coastal camps. They interviewed villagers in the Asmat region, obtained reports of sighting a lone white man toddling through shallow waters but never produced a body. The official verdict in the US was drowning while on exploration off the coast of Dutch New Guinea. A judge declared Rockefeller legally dead in 1964, yet no body, no grave, no definitive artifact that tied him to any one site. In 1969, journalist Milt Macklin travelled to the region, interviewed elders, collected testimonies from missionaries. He concluded that while the cannibal story was plausible, the physical evidence was lacking. His view, the most likely cause was that Rockefeller drowned or was taken by crocodile or shark in the open sea. The headhunting theory remained in a grey zone, vivid, provocative, but unverified. Decades later, author Carl Hoffman reviewed Dutch archives and tribal interviews and argued that several Asmat elders admitted killing and eating him as revenge for a 1958 Dutch shooting of 5 villagers. But those records are second-hand, fragmentary, contested by Rockefeller's family. The landscape itself keeps secrets. The Asmat region is inundated by tides twice daily. The coast is lined by tidal swamps, tree roots that deform and shift. Bones wash away, remains are scavenged then submerged. Small camps collapse under wind and water. After 50 years, the probability of finding intact remains is low. In the early days, the search focused on sea and shore. Later, deeper inland patrols followed leads about villages or cannibal rites. None produced documentary proof. What endures is the interplay between myth and evidence. The myth gives shape to the unknown, a man of privilege lost amid painters' masks and carving poles, then swallowed by a world he only partially understood. The evidence shows a far harsher environment. Tropical sea, strong currents, swampy coast, colonial stresses, cultural collision, and a boyish outsider far from home. Michael's twin sister Mary later wrote, she believed her brother drowned, not eaten. She spoke of the hope and grief of the family, the years spent accepting that some mysteries remain open. The Rockefeller family art collection now houses many of Michael's photographs and tribal objects. There is a wing of the Metropolitan Museum named in his honour. In that way, his absence shaped not only his story, but the story of art, collecting and cultural contact. Today, some Asmat villagers retell stories of white men among their ancestors. Some say they saw the outsider born of wealth stumble ashore, talk quietly, then vanish into their rivers. Others say the white man died at sea, nothing more. The weight of interpretation rests on the margins. The headhunting tale continues to stir imaginations and underlies a broader reckoning about colonial intrusion, art plunder, and the encounter of vastly different worlds. His disappearance continues to invite expeditions of another kind. Not only searchers for his body, but documentaries, writers, anthropologists. Maps of New Guinea show the Asmat coastline still remote. The catamarans that carried him are long gone. The seas and swamps remain. The older colonial records sit in archives. Elders pass away. Evidence becomes fainter. Memories flicker. And the story drifts more into myth. And so, Michael Rockefeller's journey stands at the intersection of art, exploration, culture, privilege, and disappearance. A man who walked away from comfort into a country where the rules changed. The story doesn't end because we still don't have the answer. The waves of the coast, the mangroves, the carved poles, the heads taken as trophies, they all point to more than a lost person. They point to a moment where worlds collided. In the end, the search is more than for a body. It is for meaning. And while we cling to the documents, the photographs, the testimonies, the truth remains submerged, either in the sea, the swamp, or the memory of those who saw him fade away. Above the clouds, Mallory and Irvine on Everest, 1924. They climbed into the thin air with fierce resolve. The wind cut at them, the mountain rose beyond any path known, and yet they left camp under the conviction that they would reach the summit. In his last letters home, George Mallory spoke of the White Mountain calling me up, and his partner Andrew Irvine, young but competent, carried the oxygen cylinders and the camera that might capture their triumph. On the 8th of June 1924, they set out from North Col, never to be seen alive again. Mallory had made several attempts on Everest before. He was experienced, admired, and determined. The British expedition of 1924 aimed to force the final steps of the Northeast Ridge route. a path longer and more exposed than the South Col route which lay within Nepal. The tools and techniques of mountaineering were still primitive by modern standards. Heavy boots, bulky clothing, crude oxygen sets, and uncertain forecasts. Mallory wrote, "We go because it is there," borrowing his own earlier credo and driving it forward into the clouds. Their letters home capture both excitement and risk. Mallory wrote from camp of the bleak ridge and the mountain's ridge of rock that reaches to the sky. He noted frost crevasses, swirling mists, and wind that would blow away a man's courage if he let it. Irvine, younger and less well known, kept quiet, but his journals show a studious nature. The oxygen machinery, the spare parts, the hope that he could play a steady hand. Together they formed a pair of ambition and youth, experience and energy. On the morning of the 6th of June they left Camp 4 at the North Col for Camp 5. They carried cylinders, cameras and food. Their photographs from the base show them smiling into the camera, bundled in wool, coats flapping in wind. They were seen that day as a tiny team ascending a mountain that dwarfed them. According to expedition records, at 12:50 p.m. on the 8th of June, their fellow climber Noel Odell reported seeing them on the ridge, moving steadily, black dots on a vast white wall, and said they were going strongly for the top. After that, the clouds came and they vanished. What followed is one of exploration's greatest mysteries. For decades, the simple facts, no return, no word, no artifacts, other than those later recovered from Mallory's body, form the bones of what would become legend. Mallory's body was found in May 1999 at roughly 8,156 m, his leg broken, his goggles in his pocket, the photograph of his wife missing. The location and condition of his remains provide evidence of a fall late in the descent, but not decisively whether he'd stood on the summit before dying. The debate revolves around one simple question. Did Mallory and Irvine reach the summit of Mount Everest before they died? If they did, they would have been the world's first. Not Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay in 1953, but Mallory and Irvine nearly 3 decades earlier. The evidence splits into two paths, supporters and skeptics, and the silence of the mountain allows both to remain open. Supporters point to the final photographs, the timing of their climb, Odell's sighting, and the fact that Mallory carried a photograph of his wife which was not found with his remains, a sign, they argue, he may have left it on the summit. They note the ice axe found in 1933, believed to belong to Irvine, at roughly 8,460 m, suggesting the pair climbed high. They also highlight that Mallory's body position suggested a fall during descent rather than on the climb. These clues build a case. Yes, they may have touched the summit and then fallen during the night or descent. Skeptics counter that the technology and conditions in 1924 made such a summit impossible. The oxygen apparatus was unreliable, the weather unpredictable, the second step on the ridge a near vertical rock face not free climbed until 1960s. They argue the timing was too late in the day for a summit and descent before nightfall. The fact that Irvine's body and camera have never been found is seen as a gap that undermines definitive proof. The evidence is circumstantial and incomplete. The discovery of Mallory's body did not end the debate, it sharpened it. His goggles were in his pocket, suggesting he fell at night. His right leg was shattered, his left leg was crossed protectively, his waist had rope jerk marks, the camera he carried was still missing. Did he reach the summit and then die on the return? Or did he turn back short of the top and fall trying to regain the route? Climbing historian Conrad Anker and others have argued both sides, walking the same ground, testing the timings, replicating conditions, yet concluding neither option is proven. The mountain itself imposes its own verdict. At 8,849 m, the air is 1/3 of sea level oxygen. Storms sweep in without warning, and the descent is more dangerous than the ascent. In 1924, climbers used heavier gear, less efficient oxygen systems, little weather forecasting, no fixed ropes beyond certain points. Mallory and Irvine were pioneers walking into unknown zones. Their letters show courage and method, but also the hubris of an era that believed mountains could be conquered as easily as maps were drawn. Modern expeditions retracing the northeast ridge continue to search for Irvine's camera, for clearer film evidence, for ridge traces or footprints frozen beneath ice. In 2024, a boot and sock with Irvine's name were found under the ice, adding fuel to the legend, but still not the final proof. Each new discovery circles back to the same question. Did they make it, or did they fall short? Their story belongs equally to ambition and mystery. The photographs taken before the attempt, the letters sent home, the tracking of oxygen bottles, the detailed notes of their supports, all provide glimpses of a journey. But the mountains swallowed the final page. The absence of a photograph, the missing camera, the unseen fall into night, all these mark the difference between proof and myth. And so, Mallory and Irvine remain symbols of exploration's greatest frontier, the unknown. Their last ascent was into clouds thicker than air, into silence that echoes still. Their letters whisper across time. Their footprints are erased by wind. The mountain waits for neither. The Woman Who Never Came Down, Wanda Rutkiewicz, 1992. The last time anyone saw her, the wind was already rising. The clouds above Kangchenjunga were building into a wall, and the mountain had begun its shift from harsh to unforgiving. Wanda Rutkiewicz stood near the high camp, wrapped in thick layers, face drawn from exhaustion but eyes steady. She told her climbing partner she would continue toward the summit. She moved upward alone, into the thinnest air on Earth, and the slopes swallowed her. Wanda was not a novice on Himalayan ground. She was one of the greatest high-altitude climbers in history, the first woman to summit K2, the third woman to climb Everest, and the first Pole, man or woman, to do so. Her life was built on resilience. Born in Poland during the war years, she grew up in a country defined by hardship and reconstruction. She studied engineering, played volleyball at a national level, and then discovered climbing, a world where strength, strategy, and self-discipline mattered more than background. By the 1970s and 1980s, she had become a force in global mountaineering. She climbed the Andes, the Caucasus, the Hindu Kush, and the Himalayas. She summited 8 of the world's 14 8,000-meter peaks, a record unmatched by most men of her era. Her climbing style was direct and bold. She preferred lightweight expeditions, minimal oxygen, and quiet persistence over loud declarations. But Kangchenjunga was different. At 8,586 meters, it is the third highest mountain on Earth, known for its brutal, cold, steep faces and unpredictable storms. Many climbers describe the mountain as remote, aloof, almost unwilling to be approached. Wanda wanted it not for records, but because she believed each peak was a step towards something inner, discipline, purpose, self-understanding. In spring 1992, she joined a small expedition attempting the mountain from the north side. The approach alone tested them. Long stretches of ice, narrow ridges, avalanche-prone slopes. Wanda moved slowly but deliberately, saving strength for the days near the top. She was 50 years old, but her acclimatization was strong and her resolve intact. On May 12th, the team reached high camp. The air there is thin enough to blur thought. The temperature drops without warning. Even resting drains energy. Another climber, Carlos Carsolio, encountered Wanda there. He spoke with her briefly, noting she looked tired but calm, focused on the summit. She told him she needed more time and would continue at her own pace. Carsolio continued upward. Hours later he reached the summit. Wanda did not follow him. At dusk, clouds surged over the ridge. Carsolio descended, passed near her tent and saw Wanda again. She said she would climb higher the next morning. He offered her water, she declined. She was composed, confident, entirely herself. She stood in that thin air just below 8,300 meters, wrapped in the blue of evening, and told him she would continue alone. No one ever saw her again. When Carsolio reached lower camps, the weather turned violent. Winds hammered the upper slopes, temperatures fell brutally, and visibility collapsed. The team waited for signs, shouts, movement, a headlamp, but the mountain gave nothing back. Days later, when the storm finally eased, climbers searched the route above the high camp but found no equipment, no clothing, no trace of her. Kangchenjunga revealed no answers. In the months that followed, speculation grew. Some believed she fell from the ridge. Others thought she might have become trapped by weather while resting between pushes. A few pointed to exhaustion, disorientation, or altitude sickness. But no theory could be confirmed without physical evidence, and the mountain kept its silence. Wanda's disappearance carried a particular weight because of who she was. She had carved a path for women in a field dominated by men. She organized all-female expeditions when few took them seriously. She led teams through storms, through political limitations, through funding challenges, through stereotypes. Her success on K2, one of the deadliest mountains, was especially symbolic. She reached its summit in 1986 during a season when many climbers died on its slopes. She survived every expedition that others thought would end her, and when she vanished on Kangchenjunga, some saw it as the mountain choosing its moment. Her absence created a deep rift in the climbing world. Poland, which revered her as a national hero, mourned the loss of a resilient symbol of strength. Other climbers spoke about how she had expanded what was possible for women in mountaineering. Young climbers studied her routes, watched her interviews, read her journals. She was living proof that the highest peaks did not belong to any one gender. Her legacy became a conversation about ambition, endurance, and the costs of pursuing difficult peaks. Many climbers spoke of how Wanda's mindset shaped them, her refusal to complain, her ability to lead with quiet authority, her belief that mountains were not to be conquered but respected. She once said that climbing gave her inner freedom, a phrase that echoed through memorial lectures and articles written after she vanished. Years after her disappearance, rumours surfaced. A surviving Tibetan villager claimed Wanda may have reached a plateau near the summit before the storm struck. Others suggested she might have found shelter in a snow cave. Still others believed she lay somewhere on the northwest ridge, beneath layers of ice and snow, preserved but unreachable. Climbers who returned to Kangchenjunga in later years searched along logical fall lines and crevasses, but found no trace. Wanda became one of the many climbers claimed by the world's highest mountains, but her place in mountaineering remained singular. Memorial plaques appeared in Poland, documentaries followed her life story. Books chronicled her achievements and the struggles she faced as a woman climbing at a time when sponsorships, equipment and recognition were rarely offered equally. Her name joined a pantheon of legends who pushed human limits and paid the price. Kangchenjunga itself is part of the story. Some Himalayan communities believe the mountain should not be stepped on beyond a certain point out of respect for the spirits that guard it. Even modern expeditions often stop just short of the summit for symbolic reasons. For Wanda, who valued cultural and spiritual dimensions of climbing, that belief may have held meaning. The mountain's remote slopes, shifting seracs and long ridges remain her final landscape. Her disappearance left an open question, not about ambition or risk, but about how far the human spirit can push toward goals that cannot be measured. Wanda's life never fit easily into simple frames. She was not climbing for fame nor chasing records for applause. She pushed herself because the mountains were the only places where she felt wholly herself. And somewhere on the upper reaches of Kangchenjunga, in a world of wind, ice and vast silence, her last steps remain, unseen, unrecorded, but carried forward in the history of every climber who follows the paths she once opened. Into the void Nicholas Jaeger on Lhotse Shah 1980. The storm rolled in without warning. The upper slopes of Lhotse Shah faded behind white. The sky sank into the mountain, and the wind folded the ridges into a single wall of noise. Climbers in the lower camp waited for a shape to appear, just one silhouette moving through the blur. They waited for hours. No one came. That was the moment the search for Nicholas Jaeger began, and the moment the mountain gave no sign that it would return him. Nicholas Jaeger was unlike most climbers of his era. A French alpinist, a doctor, a writer. He approached mountains with a mixture of precision and introspection. He climbed alone often, not out of bravado, but because solitude clarified his thoughts. His journals described risk as a space where everything unnecessary falls away. He wrote about silence, fear, patience, and the pull of high places where judgment mattered more than equipment. By the late 1970s, he'd already completed a series of remarkable climbs. He made daring solo ascents in the Alps, attempted bold routes in the Himalayas, and became known for pushing himself into environments where few followed. His expedition notes reveal a man who tested limits not for fame, but to understand how far discipline and will could carry a human being into harsh terrain. In spring 1980, he joined a French team attempting Lhotse Shah, a sister peak to Lhotse, both connected to the Everest Massif. Lhotse Shah is steep, avalanche-prone and overshadowed by its more famous neighbours. At 8,383 metres, it is one of the world's highest mountains, but also one of the least forgiving. Few teams succeeded there, and fewer still attempted solo pushes on its slopes. Jaeger acclimatised well. Colleagues later said he seemed focused, reserved, moving with purpose between tents and ridges. He studied the ice formations, the weather patterns, the route above Camp 3. On May 27th, he told teammates he would climb alone toward the higher camps, then attempt the upper face when conditions allowed. Solo climbing at that altitude is a gamble, but for Jaeger, solitude was not a burden, it was the necessary arena for his internal dialogue. Search accounts describe his departure with clarity. He left camp early, carrying minimal gear, using the thin morning light to examine the slope. He moved quickly across the first section, then began climbing the steep ice fields that lead towards Lhotse's eastern shoulder. Other climbers saw him for the last time as a small figure cutting steps into blue ice, pausing occasionally to test anchors or look upward. By midday, clouds thickened, the wind changed direction, the Himalayan sky, always unstable, collapsed into a dense shroud. Those below could no longer see the ridge. By late afternoon, the storm hid everything above Camp 3. The team waited through the night. When dawn broke and the storm eased, they began searching. The route was scanned for fresh slide paths, overturned snow, equipment fragments. They listened for calls, whistles, any sign of movement, but each rope line and anchor remained untouched. The footprints from Jaeger's ascent disappeared into blown snow. No trace led back down. They checked the couloir, steep channels where fallen climbers often slide. They checked crevasses, probing the edges carefully. They searched the avalanche run-out zones. They climbed as high as conditions allowed and found only empty slopes battered by wind. The upper mountain held still. Throughout the search, Jaeger's own writings hovered in the minds of his teammates. His journals often described the thin line between control and surrender. He wrote that solitude on a mountain is not loneliness, it is the stripping away of noise. He acknowledged that climbing alone at altitude meant accepting that rescue might not reach him, but he believed the risk sharpened his senses, made him attentive to every shift in the ice, every gust of wind. To him, the void was not an enemy, it was an element to study. The search stretched into days. Weather windows were brief. At times, clouds returned, forcing the team to retreat to lower camps and wait. At other times, the sun exposed fresh fracture lines on the face, evidence of avalanches triggered during the storm. If Jaeger had been caught in one, he might have been swept thousands of meters down the mountain. If he fell into a crevasse, ice and snow could have sealed the opening before anyone reached it. At that altitude, even a minor slip can become final. With each passing day, the team understood the likelihood of survival diminished. The mountain's silence deepened. Radios remained quiet. Snowfields erased answers faster than they could be traced. Eventually, the expedition concluded that Jaeger had been lost somewhere on the upper slopes, and the search ended. His disappearance became part of the larger history of solo attempts in the Himalayas, ambitious, courageous, and unforgiving. But his death also shaped how mountaineers spoke about solitude. Jaeger was not chasing records or attention. His writing reveals a man trying to understand the boundary between self and nature, the space where a climber's mind meets altitude and silence. After 1980, fellow climbers referenced his approach often. Some said he taught them that the mountain is not conquered but entered. Others spoke of his discipline, how he balanced precision with introspection. His books, published posthumously, shaped philosophical discussions in the French climbing community. His words about fear, risk, and clarity influenced younger mountaineers who saw climbing not merely as sport but as a way to investigate the self. Lhotse Shar itself remains a rarely climbed, dangerous peak. Avalanches, seracs, and high winds make its routes inconsistent and unpredictable. No climber has ever reported finding equipment, clothing, or remains linked to Jaeger. The mountain has held everything it knows. In later years, climbers who passed through that region reflected on the sense of absence that clings to the slope. They described the long ridge where Jaeger was last seen, the place where he paused to look upward, the place where his boot prints disappeared. They speak of it not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that high-altitude climbing is a dialogue between ambition and acceptance. Jaeger once wrote that the void is not empty, it is full of what we bring into it. His disappearance left a void in mountaineering, not empty, but filled with the questions he posed about solitude, about why we seek difficult places, about what we hope to find when the world below becomes too loud. And somewhere on Lhotse Shar, in a stretch of ice and wind that only a few humans have ever touched, his last steps remain. The mountain kept the man, but his words continued downward, carried by those who learned from him. That risk is not recklessness, solitude is not isolation, and the void is not a place to fear, but a place to understand. The explorer who went looking for the lost, Roald Amundsen, 1928. The plane slid into cloud like a knife into wool. One moment the cockpit windows showed the pale Arctic horizon, a clean line of sea ice and sky. The next, everything closed into white. Instruments trembled, the engine drummed a steady pulse. Roald Amundsen sat in the cramped fuselage of the French Latham 47 flying boat, watching the mist thicken until it felt solid. He'd flown into bad weather before, but this fog hung heavy, hiding the world below and above. Then the clouds swallowed the aircraft completely, and it was the last time anyone saw him alive. Roald Amundsen had spent most of his life entering uncertainty. Born in Norway in 1872, raised in a maritime family, he studied maps long before he saw the polar seas. In his early 20s, he joined Arctic expeditions as a crewman, learning navigation, survival, and the patience required to move through ice. By 1911, he became the first person to lead an expedition to the South Pole. The journey made him a global legend, but the quiet truth behind his fame was that he was not chasing glory. He was chasing challenges that forced him to understand nature on its own terms. After conquering the South Pole, he turned to the north. He sailed the Northwest Passage in the Goa. He flew over the Arctic in the airship Norge in 1926, reaching the North Pole along with his multinational crew. He had already crossed more ice, more sea, more sky than nearly any explorer before him. But in 1928, he faced a new kind of mission, not exploration, but rescue. The Italian airship Italia, commanded by Umberto Nobile, crashed on the Arctic ice during an expedition to the North Pole. Survivors were stranded somewhere in the drifting wilderness north of Svalbard. Nations mobilized rescue operations. Amundsen, 70 at the time, immediately offered his help. Despite past tensions with Nobile, he insisted that explorers should never be left behind. He boarded the French Latham 47 flying boat in Tromsø. The aircraft was built for long-range patrols, not calm conditions, and the Arctic weather was shifting. The crew consisted of experienced pilots and technicians. They took off on June 18th, heading north across water that reflected the grey sky so perfectly it was impossible to see where ocean ended and air began. The cold open of their final flight is recorded in fragments from radio messages and testimonies of those who watched the plane disappear. They flew into thickening mist. They expected it to break. It didn't. The Arctic fog is not like ordinary cloud. It forms low, dense and disorienting, erasing the horizon. Planes of that era had limited instrumentation. Visibility mattered more than anything. And when the fog sealed around the aircraft, the pilots had no point of reference. Hours passed with no radio contact. Searchers later tried to reconstruct the flight path, but ice drift, poor maps and cloud cover left too many unknowns. The Latham 47 simply vanished, plane, crew and Roald Amundsen into a wilderness capable of hiding wreckage for a century. What followed was one of the largest Arctic searches for a single aircraft. Norwegian, French, Soviet, Swedish and Italian teams combed the region. Ships pushed through ice floes. Seaplanes scanned the coastline. Dogsled teams traced possible landing sites. They found nothing. Days later, pieces of a pontoon washed ashore near the Tromsø coast. It belonged to the Latham 47. Many believed this meant the plane had gone down in the Barents Sea shortly after entering the fog, but no fuselage, no bodies, no personal items, no logs ever surfaced. The Arctic kept its silence. Amundsen's disappearance became part of a larger pattern, aviation disasters in polar regions that leave almost no trace. In the early 20th century, flying near the poles was an act of faith. Magnetic compasses drifted. Radios were unreliable. Weather changed in minutes. Fog created optical illusions that made the sea look like clouds and clouds look like sea. Pilots often could not tell if they were climbing or descending. Dozens of polar flights from that era ended the same way. Lost in cloud, lost in snow, lost in water. The wreckage of some planes remains undiscovered to this day, hidden beneath ice that shifts with the seasons or resting at the bottom of seas too deep to search. Amundsen's life arc made his final mission feel tragically symbolic. He had survived dogsled trips across Antarctica, storms at sea, shipwreck threats in the Northwest Passage, airship expeditions over shifting pack ice. He escaped frostbite, hunger, and the collapse of trails beneath him. But when he set out to rescue others, the risk changed. He was not on ground he could read or ice he could interpret. He was in the sky, where failure left no trail. In the decades that followed, his disappearance inspired countless theories. Some believed the plane crashed soon after entering fog, killing everyone instantly. Others argued they may have flown farther north, crashing into drifting pack ice. A few suggested they succeeded in an emergency landing but died before rescue reached them. None could be proven. Amundsen's absence shaped generations of polar explorers. His diaries and lectures influenced climbers, sailors, pilots, scientists, shifting the focus from conquest to preparation. He taught that the poles were not enemies to be defeated, but environments to be understood. His meticulous planning, his respect for indigenous survival methods, and his ability to navigate extreme conditions set standards that endure today. For Norway, his disappearance solidified his place in national memory. Streets bear his name. Research vessels carry his legacy. The story of the man who beat Scott to the South Pole became inseparable from the story of the man who vanished while trying to save another explorer. The Arctic itself remains part of the narrative. It is a place where objects remain intact for decades under ice, only to vanish again when the ice breaks. It is a place where fog can erase a plane in seconds. It is a region defined by shifting boundaries, between water and air, ice and sea, cloud and sky, and it is a region that never fully releases what it takes. Somewhere north of Tromsø, beneath water that changes colour with every passing cloud, the Latham 47 rests, its crew, its engines, its instruments, and the man who crossed the poles of the Earth. The Arctic holds them in silence, the final chapter of a life that began on maps and ended in mist. The line goes dead over the Pacific. Amelia Earhart, 1937. The story is bigger than the event. People know the name even if they've never heard the details. Amelia Earhart has become a symbol of courage, of adventure, of disappearance. Her vanishing fills bookshelves, fuels documentaries, and launches new theories every decade. Crash and sink, island landing, secret capture, drifting wreckage. But when you peel away the layers of myth, you return to a very real flight, a very small island, and a radio line that went silent over the Pacific. In 1937, Amelia Earhart was one of the most famous aviators in the world. She had crossed the Atlantic, set speed records, altitude records, distance records. She wrote books, gave lectures, fought for women's rights in aviation, and used her fame not for spectacle but for progress. When she announced she would attempt to fly around the world along the equator, the world listened. Her navigator, Fred Noonan, was an expert in celestial navigation, one of the best in the field. Together they planned a route that would take them from California across the Americas, then across Africa and Southeast Asia, and finally across the vast Pacific, where tiny islands often served as their only refueling points. Their final major challenge was the flight from Lae, New Guinea, to Howland Island, a microscopic speck of land barely 2 miles long, sitting in the middle of empty ocean. The US Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed there to guide them in with radio signals and to help them land safely. The distance was roughly 4,000 kilometers, longer than most flights of the era, far beyond any margin for error. On July 2, 1937, Amelia and Noonan took off in their twin-engine Lockheed Electra. The plane climbed slowly under its heavy load of fuel. Witnesses on the ground recorded her last words before departure. Confident, calm, determined. The aircraft flew east into a rising sun. From here, the myth takes one path, but the real evidence takes another. Hours into the flight, radio operators recorded Earhart's transmissions. Her voice was clear at first, then faded, then returned. One message reported they were on course. Another said they were flying at about 10,000 feet. But as the flight continued, problems surfaced between the aircraft's radio equipment and the Itasca's ability to send signals back. Earhart could transmit, but she could not reliably hear responses. This single failure, simple, technical, avoidable, became one of the most critical elements of the mystery. As dawn reached Howland Island, Itasca's crew scanned the sky. They prepared smoke signals. They warmed up search boats. They listened for Earhart's voice. The radio crackled. She reported they were running low on fuel. Around this time, she gave her most famous transmission. "We must be on you but cannot see you." Those words, logged carefully by the Itasca, became the backbone of every future reconstruction of the flight. Moments later, she said they were flying on a line north and south, based on celestial navigation. They were trying to intercept Howland's position. Noonan's method was sound, but it required visual contact with the island or the ship, and they had neither. Then the line went dead. Itasca sent frantic calls, no answer. They fired the ship's boilers to create more smoke. They ran the engines, expecting Amelia to appear over the horizon. Nothing came. The official assumption formed quickly. The plane had run out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific near Howland. The US Navy launched one of the largest search operations in history. Ships, aircraft, and coordinated sweeps across thousands of square miles. They found no plane, no debris, no bodies. This blank space, the absence of evidence, is where the myth took root. Over the years, new theories emerged. Some suggested the plane landed on Gardner Island, now Nikumaru, about 350 miles south of Howland. A few artifacts found there, a piece of aluminum, a shoe sole, a sextant box, fueled speculation that Earhart and Noonan may have survived for a short time on the island. Some radio distress calls heard by civilian operators across the Pacific also hinted at a crash landing on land rather than water. But none of these pieces could be definitively linked to her. Other theories proposed that the Japanese military captured Earhart and Noonan, believing them to be spies. This idea grew in the post-war period, supported by rumours, misidentified photographs and conflicting memories, but no authenticated document or physical evidence has ever confirmed it. More technical investigations focused on the Electra's fuel range. Many experts believe she had enough fuel to reach Howland if winds were calm, but winds were not calm that morning. Stronger than expected headwinds could have drained the tanks faster. If she overshot the island, she would have flown into empty ocean with no land ahead. Radio specialists have examined the transcripts for decades. Some point to mismatched frequencies, misunderstandings of radio procedures, and the possibility that Earhart's radio loop antenna was damaged earlier in the trip. If she could hear nothing from Itasca, she may not have known she was slightly off course. And at that scale, hundreds of miles of featureless sea, being slightly off course is the same as being lost. In later decades, underwater searches targeted specific regions where a plane of that size might rest. Detailed sonar scans were carried out. Multiple expeditions mapped trenches and seamounts. Some found metallic objects, but none convincingly matched the Electra. Others searched the reefs of Nikumaru, suggesting the plane may have slid underwater decades after landing. Despite all the calculations, logs, time intervals, wind estimates, navigation lines, radio bursts and search grids, one simple truth remains. After that final transmission, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan vanished into a part of the Pacific that still hides shipwrecks and aircraft from the same era. The mystery endures because the gap is real, not invented. Just a few missing minutes, a few missing miles, a few missing signals. The world still studies her last words, still measures the distances she flew, still weighs theories against each new fragment of evidence. But the line between what we know and what we don't is only as wide as the Pacific horizon she flew into, where sky and sea merge into one, and where a talented pilot and her navigator disappeared in a moment that lasted less than a breath. Brothers into the ice Gaspar and Miguel Corte-Real, 1501 to 1502. The North Atlantic in the early 1500s was not just an ocean, it was an arena of ambition. Nations sent ships into waters they barely understood, chasing land, trade, and knowledge. Storms rose without warning, icebergs drifted like fortresses, and maps changed with every voyage. In this world of shifting boundaries, two Portuguese brothers, Gaspar and Miguel Corte-Real, sailed into the cold and never returned. Their story sits inside the wider story of the Age of Discovery, where progress and disappearance often shared the same horizon. Gaspar Corte-Real came from a family steeped in exploration. His father, João Vaz Corte-Real, had sailed across the Atlantic decades earlier, earning a reputation as one of Portugal's early navigators in the Western Seas. Gaspar grew up in this atmosphere of maritime ambition. By 1500, Portugal had established routes around Africa and toward India, but the mysterious lands to the northwest still drew interest. Reports of forests, fisheries, and unfamiliar coastlines, what we now associate with Newfoundland and Labrador, appeared in the records of explorers who had been blown off course or pushed by storms. In 1501, Gaspar led a royal-sponsored voyage westward. Letters from Portuguese officials describe a fleet sailing boldly into the Atlantic, following currents that curved toward northern waters. They arrived at a coast covered in dense forests, where the sea was rich with fish and ice drifted near the shore even in warmer months. Many historians believe this was Newfoundland or Labrador. The crew explored, gathered timber samples, and captured a number of indigenous people to bring back to Portugal, a harsh and tragic practice of that era. Gaspar returned part of his fleet to Lisbon, sending back news of the landfall and carrying those captives. Royal records note that he planned to continue exploring farther north with his flagship and another vessel. That decision would set the course of the mystery. After leaving the known coast and heading into waters marked only by fog and ice, Gaspar Corte-Real vanished entirely. The last confirmed reports of him come from the ships he had already sent home. His own vessel and the men aboard it simply disappeared into the Northern Sea. Portugal waited. Months passed. Winter came. No ship appeared. The king, Manuel I, ordered another mission the following year. It would be led not by an officer or an appointed captain, but by Gaspar's own brother, Miguel Corte-Real. The letters from this period show urgency and grief intertwined with duty. Miguel believed his brother might be stranded, surviving on an unfamiliar coast, waiting for help. He wrote that he would seek Gaspar wherever the sea may hide him. It was a statement of devotion, but also of the era's confidence, sometimes misplaced, that determination could overcome nature. Miguel sailed west in 1502 following what he believed to be his brother's route. As Gaspar had done before him, Miguel reached the North Atlantic coasts, likely the same regions of Newfoundland or Labrador. He navigated between ice floes, moved along shorelines, and attempted to follow any sign of shipwrecks or settlements. Expedition logs describe harsh conditions, the cold biting through sails, fog blocking visibility, and the unpredictable drift of ice sheets. At some point during this search, Miguel made a fateful decision. He separated his ship from the rest of his fleet to investigate a region more thoroughly. The other ships waited for him at a predetermined point, but he never reappeared. When winter drew near, the crew had no choice but to return to Portugal without him. Miguel Corte-Real had vanished in the same waters that had taken Gaspar. The loss of two brothers in consecutive years shocked Portugal. Royal correspondence records efforts to determine their fate. Some believed their ships were crushed by sea ice. Others thought storms had driven them into remote bays where they were trapped. There were also rumours, passed through hearsay and foreign sailors, that a European had been taken captive by indigenous groups in the far north. These rumours persisted for years, prompting suggestions that Miguel might still be alive, but no evidence ever supported them. Maps of the early 1500s show the region as nearly blank. The oceans were decorated with guesses, sea monsters, wind lines, and empty spaces. The Corte-Real voyages helped fill some of these gaps, but the northern latitudes remained treacherous. Icebergs carved from Greenland drifting unpredictably. Fog could render navigation instruments useless. The magnetic compass behaved poorly near the pole, swinging erratically. Dead reckoning, estimating position by speed and direction, was unreliable in strong currents. In such an environment, even a small mistake could be fatal. What we know of the brothers' final days comes mostly from the official letters, royal orders, and the logs of the ships that returned. The records tell us where they sailed, what they hoped to find, and how they planned their routes. They also reveal the sorrow and confusion that followed their disappearances. King Manuel continued sending inquiries to Spain, England, and other maritime powers, hoping someone had spotted a damaged Portuguese vessel or survivors. Nothing ever emerged. Over the centuries, occasional claims arose, a carved inscription here, a supposed sighting there, a story of European artifacts in remote communities. None could be tied conclusively to the Corte-Real voyages. The North Atlantic remains a place where wooden ships can vanish completely, either sinking into deep water or breaking apart under ice, leaving no trace on the surface. The disappearances of Gaspar and Miguel became part of the greater narrative of the Age of Discovery. Europe celebrated triumphant returns, the spices from India, the gold from Africa, the new maps that redrew the world. But behind those triumphs lay stories like this. Expeditions swallowed by oceans, families that waited for ships that never appeared, kings who funded searches that yielded nothing. For Portugal, the Corte-Real brothers represented both ambition and loss. They sought new lands, new routes, new possibilities. They pushed west into waters where even experienced sailors felt fear. Their explorations helped shape early European awareness of northeastern America, yet their absence reminded everyone of the risks hidden beneath the promise of discovery. Today, the cold region they reached remains hauntingly similar to what they saw. Icebergs still break from Greenland and drift south. Fog still folds over the sea like a curtain. The coastline, rugged and forested, looks much the same, and somewhere beneath those waters, the ships of the Court Royale brothers may still rest, silent, unbroken, preserved by cold or shattered by centuries of storms. All we have of their final moments are brief entries in royal records, the letters sent home, and the knowledge that two brothers sailed into the North Atlantic with hope and purpose and did not return. Their names appear on monuments in Portugal, on charts of early Atlantic exploration, and in the long list of explorers whose courage met the unforgiving reality of unexplored sea. What became of La Pérouse, the missing French squadron, 1788? Walk into certain museums in France and you will find a quiet corner dedicated to a question that haunted an entire nation. What became of La Pérouse? Glass cases hold fragments of wood, metal fittings, navigational tools warped by salt water. Maps show dotted lines ending abruptly in the Pacific. In some coastal towns, memorials carved in stone still bear his name. These displays do not celebrate a triumphant return, they honour an absence. And that absence began in 1788, when a French squadron sailed away from Botany Bay and never came back. Jean-François de Gallo, Comte de La Pérouse, was among the most accomplished naval officers of his era. France commissioned him to lead a grand scientific voyage around the world, an expedition meant to rival the achievements of Captain Cook. His two ships, La Boussole and L'Astrolabe, carried scientists, artists, astronomers, naturalists and hydrographers. Their mission: chart unknown waters, observe distant societies, collect specimens, and expand the reach of European knowledge. France saw this journey as a statement of national prestige. The squadron left Brest in 1785. Over the next 2.5 years, they traced a vast arc across the Pacific: Cape Horn, Easter Island, Hawaii, Alaska, California, China, Japan, Siberia. They made careful surveys of coastlines, measured currents, recorded languages, sketched flora and fauna. Their journals show intense curiosity: notes about tides, volcanic landscapes, fishing tools, local traditions. La Pérouse kept his writing precise and restrained, but beneath the lines it is clear he believed he was contributing to something larger than exploration. By early 1788, the expedition reached the coast of Australia. The British First Fleet had just arrived to establish a settlement at Botany Bay. The French anchored offshore, exchanged visits with officers, and sent letters and reports back to Europe on the British supply ships. Those documents reached France safely and remain the final written words from La Pérouse. Witnesses at Botany Bay described the French ships preparing for departure, sails inspected, supplies organised, repairs completed. The officers dined with the British governor, discussed the long route home, and spoke of their next destinations, likely New Caledonia, the Santa Cruz Islands, and then the Indian Ocean. Everything seemed in order. No one suspected that this would be the last confirmed sighting of the expedition. On March 10th, 1788, La Pérouse's ships sailed out of Botany Bay. They passed the headlands, disappeared beyond the horizon, and fell into silence. Months turned into years. France expected the expedition to round the Cape of Good Hope and return to Brest, but no sails appeared off the coast. As the French Revolution began, the fate of the squadron remained unresolved. The Assembly voted to send a rescue mission, but political turmoil delayed it. Meanwhile, rumours spread. Stories of shipwrecks, of island attacks, of storms in the Pacific. None were verified. In France, La Pérouse became a symbol of the era's ambition and fragility. The king himself reportedly asked on the eve of his arrest, "Has anyone heard news of La Pérouse?" The question echoed the nation's uncertainty, not only about the explorer but about the world changing around them. Journals written by naturalists, drafts of maps, letters home. These fragments were all that remained of a mission meant to be France's great scientific leap. For 40 years, no answers came. Then, in 1826, survivors of earlier Pacific voyages reported that indigenous communities on Vanikoro, an island in the Santa Cruz group, spoke of two great ships that had come to their shores decades earlier and wrecked on the reefs. French authorities took notice. Later accounts described iron fittings, anchors, and cannon fragments scattered along the lagoon. Some islanders said a few Europeans had survived the initial wreck, built a small boat from the remains, and attempted to sail away, but they never returned. Pieces of the wrecks were eventually retrieved: navigational instruments, hull timbers, fittings stamped with markings that matched French naval specifications. The artefacts aligned with the time period and design of La Boussole and L'Astrolabe. Although no complete ship was ever raised, the evidence made the conclusion clear. La Pérouse and his men had reached Vanikoro and perished there, either in the wreck or in the months that followed. Later expeditions, French, Australian, and independent, continued to search the reefs and the surrounding ocean floor. They found more pieces: cannonballs, lead-sheathed timber, anchors, copper, and personal items. These discoveries painted a general outline of the disaster but did not fill the central gap: what exactly happened when the ship struck the reef, nor what became of the survivors who attempted to leave it in a smaller vessel. The story now bridges 2 centuries. On the one side are the well-preserved logs from the early part of the voyage, filled with scientific notes and observations. On the other side are fragments from Vanikoro, mute artifacts that tell only of a violent end. Between them lies silence. The absence of La Pérouse shaped French maritime culture. His voyage was meant to demonstrate that France could match the scientific reach of Britain's Pacific expeditions. Instead, it underscored how exploration remained at the mercy of oceans, storms, and reefs. The era's optimism met the reality of remote island groups, uncharted waters, and ships vulnerable to the smallest navigational error. In later generations, writers and historians revisited the story. Schoolchildren in France learned the line, "What became of La Pérouse?" A sentence that captured not only the loss of a man, but the uncertainty of ambition in an age of exploration. Museums now hold the recovered fragments as quiet testimony. They are small pieces, corroded metal, cracked wood, but they carry the weight of a vanished expedition. Vanikoro itself remains a remote island of dense forest, fringing reefs and calm lagoons that conceal jagged coral just below the surface. Visitors describe a place both beautiful and unforgiving. When they dive in the surrounding waters, they encounter scattered remnants of the ships, anchors resting on sand flats, iron pieces embedded in coral. Nothing lies in a single organised wreck. Instead, the sea spread the fragments over time, as if breaking the story into pieces. Somewhere beyond the reef, deeper on the slope where coral falls away into blue, the rest of the ships may still rest, buried in silt, covered by ocean life, hidden from all but the passing fish. The exact details of La Pérouse's final days remain unrecoverable, but the broad outline stands. The expedition left Botany Bay with hope and order, encountered a reef thousands of miles farther north, and faded into Pacific silence. Today, the question is no longer what became of La Pérouse, but rather how much of the story still lies undiscovered beneath the waters of Vanikoro. What we know comes from the logs he sent to Europe before leaving Australia and the evidence left on the reef. Everything between those 2 points belongs to the ocean, a narrative held in fragments shaped by waves and remembered by the artifacts preserved in quiet museum rooms far from the island where the French ships met their end. The ship with no one on board, the Mary Celeste, 1872. People often hear the story before they know the facts. A ghost ship drifting across the Atlantic sails loose, wheel unmanned, food waiting on the table, music sheets scattered, a logbook ending mid-sentence. The Mary Celeste has become one of the most famous maritime mysteries of all time, reshaped by pulp magazines, adventure novels, and television shows. But when you strip away the dramatic retellings, you discover a story that is strange, but not supernatural. The truth lies in the quiet details the fiction tends to ignore. The brigantine Mary Celeste left New York on November 7th, 1872. Captain Benjamin Briggs sailed with his wife Sarah, a young daughter, and a small crew of experienced sailors. Their cargo was industrial alcohol, denatured, extremely flammable, prone to expansion, and known for releasing vapours if exposed to heat. The plan was to sail to Genoa. Nothing in the early days of the voyage suggests trouble. Briggs was respected, calm, and meticulous. His log entries were steady and unremarkable. Almost a month later, on December 5th, The British ship DEI Gratia spotted a vessel drifting erratically near the Azores. The sails were partly set but ragged. No crew appeared on deck. The DEI Gratia's captain sent a boarding party. They climbed aboard expecting to find bodies or signs of violence. Instead, they found a ship almost fully intact, empty, silent, but seaworthy. This was the first moment the ghost ship image took hold. The cabin was not in chaos. There was no dinner left uneaten, no half-written letters on a desk, no signs of panic frozen in time. What was present were normal signs of abandonment, disordered furnishings from rough weather, water in the bilges, a missing lifeboat, and a ship that had clearly been drifting. The cargo was still there, though some barrels had leaked. The captain's papers and navigational instruments were gone, items typically taken when abandoning ship. These details are real, recorded, and consistent. But when the story entered popular imagination, writers embellished the emptiness. Entire scenes were invented for atmosphere. Over the years, stories spoke of fresh tea, smoking pipes, or a captain who vanished while writing. None of that came from the inspection reports. The real puzzle was not dramatic. It was practical. Why would an experienced captain and his crew abandon a seaworthy ship? To answer that, investigators looked closely at the logs, the condition of the brigantine and the cargo. The ship had taken on some water, roughly 3 feet in the bilges, but not enough to sink her. A sounding rod used to measure water levels had been found out of its bracket, suggesting Briggs had checked the flooding. The pump mechanism was damaged, meaning the crew may not have been able to determine accurately how much water the ship was taking on. Heavy storms were known in the region in late November. Rough seas could have soaked the decks and created the impression of deeper flooding. One of the most important clues came from the cargo. 9 barrels were found empty. These barrels were made of red oak, a type of wood more prone to leaking than white oak. Alcohol vapours are extremely volatile. If the barrels expanded or vented vapours into the hold, anyone opening the cargo hatch could have been alarmed by the fumes. Several investigators suggested that Briggs may have feared an explosion. Even a small spark, metal striking metal, could ignite the vapour. In such a case, a captain might order his crew into the lifeboat while ventilating the hold, intending to return once the air cleared. This theory matches several facts. The Mary Celeste's main hatch was found open. The lifeboat was securely lowered, not torn away, and the remaining hatches showed signs of being disturbed. Nothing suggests a violent departure. It points instead to a decision made under concern or confusion, not panic or attack. Another possibility involves navigational error. The log shows that Briggs believed he was farther east than he actually was. This miscalculation might have made him think land was nearby. If he combined fears of fumes, damaged pumps, and the belief that landfall was close, abandoning temporarily in the lifeboat could have seemed reasonable. Where the story darkens is what likely happened next. If the crew tethered the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste, the rope may have snapped in a squall. If they left voluntarily without a tow line, they may have drifted beyond sight. The Atlantic between the Azores and Portugal is unpredictable. A small lifeboat in rough seas stands almost no chance. If they attempted to row toward a coast they misjudged, exhaustion or weather could have overtaken them. None of this is sensational. It is simply the unforgiving truth of the ocean. As with many maritime mysteries, it was the lack of closure that invited fantasy. Murder plots, mutiny, giant sea creatures, pirates, all were invented long after the fact. Some suggested Briggs murdered his crew, others claimed the crew mutinied and fled. No physical evidence ever supported these theories. The valuables on board were untouched. No weapons were found in suspicious positions. The crew's belongings remained in their cabins. Everything pointed toward an orderly, not violent departure. The DEI Gratia crew sailed the abandoned Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, where an official inquiry took place. The court examined the logs, the cargo, the rigging, the signs of water, and the damage. Though speculation arose during the inquiry, no proof of wrongdoing emerged. The court left the cause of abandonment officially unknown, which only strengthened the mystery. As decades passed, the Mary Celeste story grew. Novelists dramatized it. Newspapers embellished details. Television documentaries added theories designed to captivate audiences. But historians, maritime specialists, and wreck investigators consistently returned to the sober facts. There is no sign of violence, no sign of supernatural events, no sign of piracy, and no sign of mutiny. What remains is the most grounded explanation. A cautious captain, faced with a combination of water in the bilges, damaged pumps, volatile cargo, storms, and uncertain navigation, made a reasonable decision to leave temporarily, unaware that the sea would make the lifeboat's return impossible. The real tragedy is not a ghost ship. It is a family and crew lost to the ocean, likely believing they were only stepping away for minutes. And yet, the enduring legend of the Mary Celeste proves something deeper. Sometimes the simplest explanation, though quiet and unsensational, struggles to compete with the power of an empty deck drifting across the horizon, carrying only questions and silence. Lost patrol over the Bermuda Triangle, Flight 19, 1945. The legend usually starts with a dramatic image. 5 Navy aircraft forming up over Florida, disappearing into a patch of ocean that later writers would call the Bermuda Triangle. Over time, the story was retold with strange lights, compass madness, sudden fog, and supernatural forces pulling planes out of the sky. It became one of the most famous disappearances ever connected to that region. But the real Flight 19, what actually happened, looks very different when you peel away the layers of myth and return to the records of the day. On the afternoon of December 5th, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers prepared for a routine training mission from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale. Their assignment was simple: fly east for a bombing practice run, then turn north, then west, and return to base. The men were young, experienced enough to handle the aircraft, and familiar with Florida's coastal skies. Their leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, was a seasoned aviator. Nothing in the plan suggested danger. The planes took off shortly after 2 p.m. They completed the bombing exercise successfully. But the first sign of confusion came as they turned north. Radio operators on the ground began to receive uncertain messages from Taylor. His voice sounded composed, not panicked, but he seemed unsure of his position. He reported that both of his compasses were malfunctioning and that he believed they were flying over the Florida Keys. That belief would define everything that followed. If Taylor had truly been above the Keys, then turning northeast would bring the squadron toward mainland Florida. But he wasn't above the Keys at all. The flight, based on later signal triangulation, was far to the northeast, over open ocean. When Taylor guided the formation to northeast, he unknowingly steered them away from land, not toward it. Each mile they travelled put them farther from safety. Radio transmission logs describe increasing confusion as the afternoon wore on. Some of the junior pilots seemed to think they were heading the wrong way. One suggested turning west, but procedure required them to follow their leader. Taylor insisted they fly east, then north, then east again. Ground stations attempted to give instructions, but the signals were faint. Interference grew as daylight faded. By late afternoon, storms formed in the area. The sky darkened, visibility dropped, and the winds picked up. Flight 19's fuel reserves were dwindling. The TBM Avenger wasn't built for long-distance flight. It relied on precise headings and careful fuel management. With each change in direction, more minutes burned away. As the situation worsened, the Navy launched a search plane, a PBM Mariner, to locate the squadron. It took off with a full crew and headed toward the last estimated position of the Avengers. But within minutes of its departure, a large explosion was seen on the surface of the ocean by a ship patrolling nearby. The sighting matched the Mariner's flight path. It was presumed that the search plane itself had suffered a catastrophic malfunction and exploded in mid-air. All hands aboard were lost. The ocean had claimed not only the missing patrol but its rescue aircraft as well. Night fell. Flight 19 continued drifting farther into darkness. Radio logs recorded faint, broken messages. Talk of low fuel, uncertainty, requests for guidance that never fully reached the ground. Just after 7 p.m, the last transmission was received. Taylor sounded calm. He told his men that when the first plane ran out of fuel, they would all ditch together. Then, silence. No emergency signal, no flare, no further contact. The planes simply dropped off the air. The Navy launched one of the largest air and sea searches in its history up to that point. Hundreds of ships and aircraft combed the region for days. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no life rafts, no bodies. The absence of wreckage fed the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. It seemed impossible that 5 large aircraft and a rescue plane could vanish without leaving a trace. But the waters east of Florida are deep, the current strong, and winter storms can scatter debris across enormous distances. When the Navy completed its investigation months later, it issued a report concluding that the squadron most likely became disoriented, flew far offshore, and ran out of fuel over deep ocean. The cause was listed as unknown, not because there was evidence of anything extraordinary, but because the exact chain of navigational errors could not be reconstructed with certainty. That single word, unknown, helped ignite the legend. In the decades that followed, writers transformed the real disappearance into something mystical. They spoke of strange magnetic forces that shut down compasses, seawater boiling beneath aircraft, bright lights rising from the waves. But those stories came not from eyewitness accounts or Navy logs, they came from imagination. The real evidence points towards something much more grounded: human error, weather, limited technology, and a region known for sudden storms and tricky navigation. The area between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico has always been a heavily travelled corridor. It has also seen countless accidents long before the term Bermuda Triangle was invented. Ships hit reefs or ran aground. Early aircraft with limited instruments became lost in haze or cloud. Strong currents can carry wreckage great distances or swallow it entirely. The region's reputation grew not from supernatural events, but simply from the volume of traffic and the difficulty of its conditions. Flight 19 became the emblem of that reputation. The image of 5 planes disappearing together, followed by the loss of the rescue aircraft, was dramatic, haunting, and easy to mythologize. But the truth is stark. The squadron likely ditched in a dark sea, in rough waves, with no horizon and failing visibility. The men inside had no survival rafts, no tracking beacons, no modern emergency equipment. If they hit the water with force, the planes would have broken apart and sunk quickly. If they survived the impact, the waves and cold would have overwhelmed them before help arrived. The ocean does not always give back what it takes. The disappearance of Flight 19 is tragic, not mysterious. It reflects the vulnerabilities of early aviation, the limits of navigation in 1945, and the unforgiving nature of the Atlantic. The myth of the Bermuda Triangle adds drama, but the real story, 5 aircraft lost in worsening weather, guided by a leader who believed he was somewhere he was not, is complete without it. Smoke on the Ridge, the disappearance of Dennis Martin, 1969. On a summer afternoon in 1969, high on a grassy ridge near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, a group of families gathered for what should have been an uncomplicated day in the mountains. Fathers and sons stood on Spence Field, a wide meadow surrounded by thick forest. The children were laughing, playing, and moving in and out of view among the low shrubs. Within minutes the laughter ended, and a silence settled that no one on the ridge would ever forget. 6-year-old Dennis Martin, last seen slipping behind a bush to hide, was gone. Spence Field sits along the Appalachian spine of the Great Smoky Mountains, a place where rolling grass tops abruptly meet deep tangled woods. Trails curve along ridgelines, but only yards away the vegetation becomes dense, uneven, and disorienting. On that afternoon, the sky slowly thickened with cloud. Visibility shortened, and a light breeze carried traces of moisture in the air. The families noticed none of this at first. They were watching the boys prepare a small prank. Dennis and the other children had decided to circle around and jump out to surprise the adults. The children separated. Some ran to the right, others moved to the left. Dennis, smaller and quieter than the rest, slipped behind a patch of brush near the tree line. His father watched him move. The moment lasted seconds. The other children reappeared first, laughing, running toward the adults. Dennis did not. His father walked toward the spot where he had last seen his son. He expected to find Dennis crouching, waiting to spring out in triumph. Instead, there was nothing but the edge of woods, dark, silent, and impossibly thick. The father called his son's name. He heard only the whisper of wind through the trees. He stepped farther into the brush, then farther still, calling louder. The adults spread out. Within minutes, concern became fear. The last confirmed sighting of Dennis Martin was at that small patch of brush on Spence Field, a few steps from the forest line. Everything that followed was shaped around that point. As the family searched, clouds thickened into fog. The Smokies are notorious for sudden weather changes. Warm air rising from the valleys meets cooler air on the ridges, producing mist that can swallow entire slopes in minutes. The father ran down the Appalachian Trail toward the nearby Russell Field shelter, thinking Dennis might have walked downhill. Another family member headed in a different direction. They searched until dusk, but no small figure appeared, no voice called back. Night brought rain, steady, cold and heavy. Temperatures dropped. Any tracks a child might have left were washed away. The forest floor became slick. Tributaries swelled. In the space of a few hours, the environment shifted from a pleasant afternoon to a steep, wet, confusing wilderness. By morning, word had reached park rangers. What began as a family search turned into one of the largest mobilizations in the history of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Rangers, volunteers, experienced hikers, Boy Scouts and later military personnel arrived with radios, maps and search dogs. Helicopters flew low over ridges, scanning for movement or bright clothing. On the ground, teams formed grids and began moving through the ravines and slopes around Spence Field. But the terrain resisted every effort. The ridges are steep and irregular, cut by hidden drop-offs and narrow drainages that twist in unexpected directions. Underbrush can be shoulder-high. A child moving downhill could disappear from sight within seconds. Searchers described the forest as claustrophobic, a place where visibility collapsed into a tunnel only a few feet wide. Every few yards, their boots sank into wet leaves and mud. Rain continued for days. Fog rose from the valleys and hugged the slopes. Helicopters often had to pull back because the pilots could not see the ridge lines. The search dogs struggled in the wet conditions. Scents were washed away or scattered unpredictably. Volunteers slid into ravines, scraping against rocks and roots, knowing that a 6-year-old's steps would leave far less trace than their own. The search radius expanded from Spence Field to the dense valleys below. One ravine in particular drew attention, the Little River drainage. If Dennis had wandered downhill, even by accident, the slope could have carried him into that direction. Teams entered the valley, crossing streams, pushing through thorns, calling his name. They found nothing. No clothing, no shoe prints, no broken branches that clearly marked a child's passage. As days turned into a week, the number of searchers grew. At its peak, more than 1,000 people were combing the mountains. Their sheer presence caused unexpected complications. Large groups trampled potential clues without noticing. Paths that might have shown a child's movement became tangled with boot prints. The massive effort helped cover ground, but it also created confusion in tracking. Military teams arrived later, bringing specialized training. Green Berets moved through areas too steep or dangerous for volunteers. They searched caves, overhangs, and remote pockets of forest. Rangers coordinated the sections, marking off areas that had been cleared and those that still needed attention. The coverage grew increasingly thorough. Still, the mountains offered nothing. During the long days of searching, the weather stayed unpredictable. Fog rolled over the ridges, lifting for minutes, then settling again. The Smokies create their own microclimate. Temperature shifts, sudden cloud formation, and mist that can reduce visibility to only a few meters. Searchers described walking through cloud walls so dense they could barely see the outlines of nearby trees. Some reported hearing faint sounds, branches snapping far in the distance, the suggestion of a cry, but none of these led to findings. Hope flickered with each report, but always faded. As the search progressed, theories varied. Some thought Dennis might have followed the Appalachian Trail until exhaustion. Others believed he might have slipped into a ravine or creek and been carried away. A few suggested he had hidden somewhere and become disoriented in the fog. All theories remained possibilities, but none were supported by evidence. After weeks of searching, the official effort scaled back. Volunteers returned home, rangers continued smaller, targeted searches, reviewing maps, checking for overlooked ground. But the forest gave no answers. Not a scrap of fabric, not a shoe, not a trace. The mountains held their silence. Spence Field today looks much like it did that afternoon in 1969. Quiet, open, surrounded by forest that rises sharply and conceals everything beyond a few yards. Hikers pass through unaware of the details, but those who know the story often stop and look toward the tree line. It is easy to imagine how quickly a child could vanish between a single breath and the next. The disappearance of Dennis Martin remains one of the Smokies' most enduring mysteries. It is a story of a moment, one instant on a calm afternoon when a small shape slipped behind a shrub, and then the vast, complex search that followed through rain, fog, steep terrain, and dense, echoing woods. A moment of innocence followed by weeks of relentless effort, and then an empty landscape that still carries the questions left behind. The Old Man and the Cold Sea. Bill Tillman, 1977. In the world of exploration, some people slow down with age. Bill Tillman did the opposite. Well into his 70s, when most adventurers were writing memoirs or speaking at clubs, he was still standing on the decks of small wooden boats, setting his course toward mountains no one had climbed and seas most sailors avoided. His name had already entered the history of mountaineering and sailing, yet his final chapter would unfold on an obscure tugboat in the South Atlantic, a vessel named En Avant, and end in a silence as vast as the ocean he loved. Tillman's life was shaped by understatement. He had summited some of the great peaks of the Himalaya, including early Everest attempts and the first ascent of Nanda Devi, one of the most difficult mountains in the world. He travelled lightly, spoke quietly, and distrusted anything excessive. He preferred simple tools, minimal crew, and small vessels. He believed that hardship was something to accept, not avoid. This ethos shaped him through decades of climbing and years of ocean voyages to remote coastlines. By the time he reached his 70s, Tillman had shifted from climbing to sailing, but the goal was the same: reach places that felt untouched. He used small pilot cutters, traditional wooden sailboats, to reach Greenland, Arctic fjords, sub-Antarctic islands, and the wild coasts of Patagonia. Many of these voyages involved crew he barely knew, storms that lasted days, near-sinking incidents, and repairs done with whatever scraps were on board. But Tillman thrived in this constant exposure to the elements. He often joked that comfort was the enemy of adventure. In 1977, he was invited to join a voyage toward Antarctica on a refitted tugboat named En Avant. The tug was not a sleek vessel built for high seas, it was a converted working boat, purchased second-hand and being prepared for a long journey south. The plan was bold: sail from South America toward the sub-Antarctic islands, then farther if conditions allowed. Tillman, at 79 years old, did not hesitate. He accepted the offer and travelled to Brazil to meet the boat. In Rio de Janeiro, Tillman boarded En Avant along with a small international crew. The tug had been refitted, but it remained a humble vessel: one engine, basic navigation equipment, and limited redundancy. Reports from the time described the preparations as spirited but modest, characteristic of many expedition boats of the era. There was nothing luxurious about the accommodation or the gear. Tillman, accustomed to minimal comfort, found it all quite acceptable. The departure from Rio was quiet. There were no news cameras, no journalists, no speeches, just a group of sailors pushing off from the dock, turning the bow south and heading into the open Atlantic. The route toward the Falklands follows a stretch of water known for unpredictable conditions. The South Atlantic can shift from calm to violent within hours. Winds funnel northward from the Southern Ocean, and winter storms can form rapidly. Waves build long, heavy, and powerful. Even modern ships treat this region with caution. Somewhere along that route, between Rio de Janeiro and the Falkland Islands, the En Avant vanished. There was no distress signal, no fragments washed ashore, no life rafts spotted by passing ships, no radio communication indicating trouble. The last confirmed sighting of the vessel was a routine departure from Brazil. After that, the ocean simply kept what it took. Search efforts began when the vessel failed to arrive on schedule. The maritime authorities in the Falklands reported no incoming communication. Ships along the common southbound route had seen nothing unusual. The tug's absence at the expected time raised concern, and messages were sent to ports along the Brazilian coast. No sightings were reported. The En Avant, its crew, and Bill Tillman had become untraceable. Theories surfaced, but none had evidence strong enough to answer the central question. The tug may have encountered a South Atlantic storm and capsized. It may have suffered a structural failure. Old wooden boats and converted tugs were vulnerable to leaks, mechanical breakdowns, or hull stress. It may have collided with floating debris, such as a partially submerged container or a whale, something known to cause sudden disasters for small vessels. It may even have experienced an onboard fire, an engine explosion, or a catastrophic flooding event, but these were only possibilities. No wreckage was ever found. For those who knew Tillman, the disappearance carried a strange sense of fitting symmetry. His entire life had followed a path toward remote risk: high mountains where rescue was impossible, Arctic channels where ice could trap a vessel in minutes, and empty stretches of ocean where a single mechanical failure meant isolation. Tillman understood these risks intimately. He accepted them willingly, and he chose to keep exploring long after age would have given him reason to stop. His disappearance also echoed the fates of earlier explorers who had vanished at sea, men drawn to the edge of the known world, lost beyond the point where weather, waves, and geography can be easily reconstructed. Tillman's end was not one of drama or fanfare, but of quiet withdrawal into a place he had spent decades chasing, the edge of human reach. In the years after the En Avant vanished, memories of Tillman took on a quality shaped by his writing. He had always been modest, skeptical of glory, and unimpressed by fanfare. Friends and fellow adventurers described him as someone who could endure almost anything without complaint. He disdained comfort, distrusted technology he didn't consider essential, and relied on his wits. His books often read as if the world he sought existed in the tension between hardship and beauty, a world where danger sharpened experience rather than diminishing it. In that context, the final voyage feels consistent with the life he lived. It took him once more to the boundary between land and the unknown, aboard a vessel that required adaptation and resourcefulness, headed toward waters that mirrored the austere challenges he always sought. Today, the South Atlantic between Rio and the Falklands remains vast, cold, and largely unchanged. Modern ships travel the same waters, but storms still roll through without warning, and the sea retains the ability to hide even large vessels without trace. Somewhere beneath those waves, or perhaps scattered across an unmarked seafloor, the En Avant rests with its crew. Tillman's name continues to echo through climbing clubs, sailing circles, and the stories of those who still chase remote places. His disappearance, like many before his, offers only the final certainty that the sea gives no explanations. The last chapter of a life spent chasing the world's edges ended on another journey toward the far south, a place of wind, cold, and empty horizons, and the ocean simply did not return him. The scientist who fell through the ice. Konrad Königs Stefan, 2020. The jagged whiteness stretches without end. A desert of ice shimmering in sunlight, cracked by hidden rivers of meltwater and scarred by shifting deep fractures. This is the ice sheet of Greenland, the place not only of nature's raw power, but of one of the greatest warnings our planet has received. In the heart of that frozen landscape stood a scientist whose life and death would both tell the story of change. That man was Konrad Königs Stefan. Greenland is one of the world's fastest warming places. The ice surface is dropping, the glaciers flow faster, and the meltwater rushes into the ocean in ever greater volumes. Each year, the story of loss and transformation grows clearer. It is here that Stefan made his mark. For decades he measured, recorded, and spoke of the ice sheet's changes, its mass loss, its fissures, its accelerating slide into the sea. His work turned data into alarm, a tool for understanding a planet shifting underfoot. Königs Stefan was born in Switzerland in 1952. He studied climate science, snow cover, and ice dynamics, earning a doctorate and then moving into field research. In the 1970s, he travelled to the Arctic, wintered on floes, measured snow and sea ice, and learned how even remote ice could tell stories of global change. By the late 1980s, he turned his focus to Greenland's vast inland sheet, a mountain of ice covering roughly 2 million square kilometres. In 1990, Stefan established a research outpost known as Swiss Camp, a small cluster of huts on the ice sheet, designed to monitor weather, snow accumulation and ice movement. From that platform, he and his teams drilled into ice, installed automatic weather stations, and collected years of data that showed unmistakable trends: warmer winters, more melt, the ice surface sinking year after year. He published dozens of papers, advised policymakers, and became a central figure in understanding how Greenland would contribute to sea level rise. His message was clear: this ice is not stable. It is changing faster than we once believed. In early papers, he estimated that sea level rise from Greenland alone could reach around a metre by 2100 if current trends continued. His work became a foundation for global climate models, and his voice became one of those scientists we turned to when we asked whether the warming world was truly underway. By August 2020, Stefan was 68 years old and still heading into the field. Swiss Camp had become partly symbolic, a place where few scientists wanted to go, because once you get that deep into the ice sheet, every step is a negotiation with risk. Crevasses open, meltwater runs beneath snow, weather can collapse tents, and visibility can vanish in fog or snow. On August 5th, he flew into Swiss camp with a small team of young researchers. Unusual conditions had already begun, a summer of heightened melt, deeper snowmelt lakes, more crevassing than usual around the camp area. He and the team stabilized their tents, checked the network of weather stations, and prepared to exit in a few days. Unlike many of his earlier visits, this one came after a long season of melt and under unusual ice conditions. On August 8th, Stefan walked toward one of the stations to retrieve a data card. Routine work. Visibility was modest, wind gusts stronger than expected, and under the snow surface there may have been hidden weakness. He left the flagged safe zone and walked a short distance, including across snow bridging a hidden trough. The next moment, the firm surface gave way. He plunged into a crevasse filled with meltwater, the kind of feature that forms when surface meltwater drains through cracks deep into the ice sheet. A fall into such a gap can happen without warning and leave no surface trace. The rescue team, deployed immediately, probed the snow, used ropes, lowered searchers into available openings, but found nothing of Stefan. The water was dark, deep, and the ice walls unstable. His harness and personal gear were left inside the station tent, a clear indication he never returned. He vanished into the very landscape he studied so closely. His death underscored a painful irony. The glacier he spent decades warning about had become more dangerous than ever, and in that danger it claimed him. Colleagues described him as comfortable anywhere on the ice sheet, someone who braved storms, crevasse fields, sub-zero winds and isolation. Yet even he could not anticipate how the ice sheet's own dynamics, accelerated by warming and melt, had changed the margin where humans walked with caution. Stefan's notes from earlier in his career echo now with new poignancy. He wrote of fast-moving glaciers and of meltwater percolating through ice, of structural changes in the sheet beneath our feet. He spoke of the ice sheet as alive and shifting, capable of hidden threats. In his final month, he said the camp's safe perimeter was no longer as reliable as it once was. Days earlier, he and his team had marked melt-drain channels, drilled test holes and moved tents. They sensed the ground was less predictable, but the work had to continue. Now, his absence reverberates in the community of glaciologists and climate scientists. His field network continues. The weather stations still upload data. His students carry on. Greenland has named a glacier after him, Cermak Konrad Stefan, an enormous honour and a stark reminder of what his life represented. Deep commitment and the risk inherent in the very landscape where he fell. In many ways, Stefan's disappearance represents more than one man lost on remote ice. It represents a landscape transformed. A place that was once predictable, where ice logic still held, has now become messy, fractured, melting fast and unpredictable underfoot. The ice sheet was already the scene of global concern. His fall made the scene personal, and so the ice sheet he studied, walked across, charted, argued about and warned about took him. Not in a blaze of spectacle, but in one moment of walking across thin snow, into something that once might have been safe, but no longer was. Every case ends the same way, with someone missing and a landscape that stays silent. Some left traces, some left nothing at all, and each story shows how quickly control can fade in places we think we understand. We may never know exactly what happened to them, but their stories remain, clear reminders of how thin the line is between presence and disappearance, and how much of the world still keeps its secrets.